This is a story about a couple who worked very hard to achieve the good life, the perfect relationship, and children that love them and bring them joy. But as they say, money can't buy happiness, and you can only hide your secrets for so long. Richard Heikkila was born on July 30th, 1942. His family migrated to Cleveland, Ohio in the 19th century and settled near the shore of Lake Erie. Dawn Elaine Reinhard was born on February 2nd, 1944, also in Ohio, just northeast of Marion. On September 19, 1964, Richard and Dawn got married. Richard was 22, and Dawn was only 20. They were a young, happy couple, looking forward to spending the rest of their lives together. Richard was attending Ohio State University. He was earning his bachelor's degree in physiological chemistry in 1965 and working on his PhD. A couple of years after they were married, the couple began trying to conceive a child. Richard had just graduated with his PhD in physiological chemistry and was conducting research in biophysics. He was doing this at a laboratory at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons as a research associate. The baby was born on August 7, 1970. His biological mother delivered him at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York, but was admitted under a false name. As soon as she gave birth, she ran out of the hospital and abandoned her son. He spent the first 5 months of his life in foster care while the state tried to locate his biological parents. This was not successful, therefore he was officially put up for adoption. In February 1971, Dawn and Richard adopted the baby when he was only 6 months old, and they named him Matthew Eric Heikkila. Dawn felt like she was absolutely made to be a mother, and she spent all of her time being a stay-at-home mom while Richard focused on his scientific research. To their surprise, just a couple of months after the adoption, Dawn found out she was pregnant. It was a miracle. They couldn't believe it. They always wanted a big family, but they never thought this would ever be possible, especially after trying for so long. It's actually been said that once couples stop trying, sometimes things just happen naturally on their own, and that's what seemed to happen for the Heikkilas. Dawn was a few months pregnant already when she found out, and she was just so busy with baby Matthew that she hadn't noticed. Soon they found out it was going to be another baby boy, and Dawn and Richard were so happy. The brothers would be best friends. They would have one another to play with and grow up together. Plus, Dawn didn't have to do much to welcome their second son into the world. Since she had already purchased and was gifted so many baby toys and items, it was very easy for her to transition from one boy to two. Joshua David Heikkila was born on November 15, 1971. The boys were just over a year apart, with Matthew being 15 months old, so they were raised like twins, sharing everything and spending every waking moment together. Something to keep in mind is that the first 5 years of life are referred to as the formative years. These are the years in which a child experiences rapid cognitive, social, emotional, and physical development. In these first 5 years of life, experiences and relationships actually stimulate a child's development. It makes millions of connections in their brains, and they develop these connections faster in the first 5 years than at any other time in their entire lives. This is the time when the foundations for learning, health, and behavior throughout life are laid down. The reason I'm mentioning this is because with two very young children close in age to raise at the very same time, one that's biological and one that's adopted, there is a chance that parents' attention can be split between the two. Though it may not be on purpose, it may be easier and more natural to focus more attention on the biological child. Most times, after giving birth, a newborn needs a lot of attention from their mother. They need the skin-to-skin contact, the breastfeeding, the coddling, whereas an adopted child that's already an infant or toddler is past those stages. It's a delicate balance. Bonding takes time, and it may be harder for an adoptive parent to feel the same bond with their adopted child. It's no fault of their own. It's merely how we are wired. This is not to say an adoptive parent won't and can't love their adopted child just as much, if not more, than their biological children. The other child who never got to bond with their own biological mother may feel that lack of attention, even though it's only subconscious. Some adopted children experience what's known as attachment trauma. According to Bright Quest Treatment Centers, attachment trauma is a disruption in the important process of bonding between a baby or child and their primary caregiver. It can be as simple as a lack of attention or affection, though the consequences of attachment trauma are far-reaching and long-lasting. Matthew had been abandoned. He never attached to a biological mother. He was given to nurses, then to the state, and eventually to foster care, and finally to Dawn and Richard. A friend of the family, Susan Whitaker, said that Dawn was a nearly perfect parent. She was willing to lay down her life for Matthew and Joshua. The family spent 8 years living in Hohokus, New Jersey. It's a quaint, little tight-knit town in Bergen County. The population 10 years ago was only a little over 4,000 people. It's primarily an upper-class and upper-middle-class community, and it's known to be one of the best places to live in New Jersey. From a young age, it was apparent that the Heikkila boys were very different, not only in the way that they looked, with Matt having dark brown hair, olive skin, and dark, almost black eyes, and Josh with blonde hair, fair skin, and big blue eyes, but also different in the way they acted. Matt was very quiet and preferred to be by himself, whereas Josh was happy, always smiling, and seemed to like being close to his family and friends. A neighbor and very good friend from right across the street, Mrs. Schaefer, came running over to the Heikkilas with her newborn daughter, just a few weeks old, in her arms, holding Matt, only 2, firmly by the wrist, with her 4-year-old Kenny in tow. The mother was furious, and she told Dawn that Matt had stuffed her newborn's mouth full of rocks. Though frightened and upset, Dawn and Mrs. Schaefer chalked it up to the boys innocently playing, and sometimes the playing got out of hand, especially when Matt was around. During summer camp, when Matt was only 4, the director pulled Dawn aside to let her know he was really hard for the counselors to handle. He had actually bitten and kicked a little girl, and months earlier he had been abusive to her little brother, who was a preschool classmate of Matt. She explained that Matt was always picking fights with kids, and he seemed to be aggressive for no reason. Dawn insisted she was going to take care of it, but it didn't seem to change anything. His behavior just seemed to get worse. The next summer, a mother called to let Dawn know that Matt had stabbed her son in the stomach with a pitchfork while they were playing in the backyard. I'm thinking, who's watching these kids? Though Dawn was not concerned, she thought boys will be boys. In 1979, Richard's research took him to the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, so his family moved to Bernards Township. It's known as a charming town, rich with history, breathtakingly beautiful scenery, and a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The residents are known for their community spirit and volunteerism. It sounds like somewhere you would live in a fairy tale. The Heikkilas moved into a big, 3,000-square-foot, 2-story home with 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a recreation room, a fireplace, and a spacious, gorgeous front porch, great for morning coffee in a rocking chair. They had a 2-tiered wooden back deck, which was perfect for entertaining, and a basketball hoop at the end of their driveway. It was a dream home and ideal for the boys and their parents. The Heikkilas fit right in, and they became very popular in their neighborhood of Basking Ridge. They were known to invite anyone and everyone over to their large, beautiful home for barbecues. Neighbors recall the family would even come over to everyone's houses and sing Christmas carols during the holidays. There was one neighbor, though, that had a little bit of a different perspective. His name was Chris Schmidt. He met the family when Matt was about 10, and he said there was something off about him. He was really quiet, too quiet, and he would stare at you and say nothing. It seemed like he was staring right through you. Chris said he just seemed different, and it was around this time that Matthew's problems became more apparent. Richard was gone a lot for his job, and his hard work actually paid off. He was awarded the Javits Neuroscience Award in 1987. It's one of the most prestigious awards granted by the National Institutes of Health. From the outside looking in, the Heikkilas seemed to have the perfect all-American family. Don't they always? As the boys got older and were in school full-time, Dawn began to study to obtain her real estate license and eventually started working as a realtor in their wooded, upscale suburb. It didn't take long for Dawn to become very successful, but that meant less time devoted to the boys. This may have affected Matt because, when he was only 12, he was already getting in trouble with the law. He was rebelling. The police were sent to the Heikkilas' house to confront Matt and his parents about Matt riding a dirt bike illegally on a road near their house. A neighbor was outside later that afternoon, and she actually heard Dawn crying in the backyard. She went over there and asked her if everything was okay. Dawn admitted she was stressed. She didn't know what to do. She could not handle Matthew. The neighbor comforted her and told her it was probably a phase and Matt would likely grow out of it. Unfortunately, not much changed. It seemed like Matt wasn't scared of punishment or authority. Visits by the police became more and more frequent and more serious over the years. Dawn and Richard tried their very best. They knew Matt was troubled, but they didn't understand where his anger was coming from. However, there was a common theme. He was extremely jealous of Josh. It started pretty early on, when the boys were around kindergarten age. Yes, brothers can be jealous of one another. Maybe one gets a better toy for Christmas, the other one maybe gets a better seat on an airplane, that sort of thing. But this wasn't normal sibling rivalry. Matt would throw full-on temper tantrums when he wasn't getting enough attention. He would get in fights with Josh, screaming that his parents didn't love him. They had not told Matt that he was adopted, but kids are smart and they can sense things. Matt would continuously ask his family why he did not look like them. But they lied to him. They continued to make excuses, like he inherited his father's genes. It wasn't a secret for long. Once Matt knew the real story about how Dawn and Richard had longed for their own child before adopting Matt, he felt like he didn't have a purpose within the family. Once Josh, the miracle child, was born, Matt felt he was old news. Matthew would purposely separate himself from his family, and it made it really hard to bond with him. It was also really hard for him to make friends at school, so he became more and more antisocial. It didn't help that Josh never got in trouble. Maybe it was by nature, or maybe he saw the way Matt was acting, and he was learning from his big brother's mistakes. But this only made Matt angrier, because it seemed like Josh could do no wrong. While Matt's teachers were having conferences with his parents about him being out of control in class, Josh's teachers were sending home letters praising Joshua, how smart, well-behaved, and talented he was. It seemed it was true, though. Richard, Dawn, and Josh were all overachievers by nature. They liked things tidy and organized. Matt, he just tried to get by with mediocre grades. His room was always a mess. He was just different. Josh was also very tall. He was athletic and won many awards for his athleticism. Matt was shorter. He had no coordination. He didn't excel at sports, unless committing crime is considered a sport. When the boys were still in elementary school, the parents took classes to learn how to deal with Matthew's behavior. Despite their very best efforts to treat the boys the same, Matt still believed they favored Josh, no matter what they did. There were times when Josh would instigate Matthew, but it was only when the boys were already fighting and at odds. In these moments, the fact that Matt was adopted did get thrown around in petty arguments, but it affected Matt way deeper than anyone could have imagined. Matt did grow up to become a handsome teenage boy. He had a big white smile, dimples in his cheeks, and he certainly had one talent: attracting females. While Josh was focused on church, school, and sports, Matthew had that bad boy sex appeal. In school, Matt got a lot of attention from girls. He seemed thrilling to them at first, but many of the relationships wouldn't last long because they usually found some kind of flaw in him. Whether it was his pathological lying, his stealing, or his failing grades, he just wasn't right for them. That didn't stop women from falling for him, though, because he had this ability to come off as very charismatic and charming. He was still getting in trouble, though, so the family tried counseling together. They loved Matthew, they just didn't know how to prove it to him. They tried medications and behavioral therapy, and even decided to have Matt go through programs at a few psychiatric facilities. They thought this might change some of his bad habits and hopefully get through to him. One thing that friends of the family noticed, though, was that the Heikkilas were very lenient on the boys. They would let Matt's behavior slide all the time, but also noted that Dawn had tried disciplining Matt too, and it seemed like it had no effect on his behavior either way. All the counseling and treatments were very expensive, and it didn't seem to help. However, it did prove that Matt never felt like he fit in anywhere, including his own home. He told one psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Sadoff, that he could tell there was favoritism towards Josh, and he couldn't get over it. I really wish Matt could have found his identity through something else. It seems like he was so invested in this identity as it related to his family, but he was old enough to make a life for himself aside from all of that as he became an adult. However, you will learn more about the reasons he was unable to do so, most of which had to do with addiction. The Heikkilas feared if they didn't do something more, Matt could go even more astray. They transferred him to a private high school called Bailey Ellard in Madison for a year. They were hoping these teachers would give him one-on-one attention, but it didn't help. Matt ended up dropping out of school. He did end up earning his GED, but Josh, on the other hand, graduated valedictorian of his senior class. Josh even appeared in the Morris County newspaper, along with an article he was interviewed for. It read, "The class valedictorian, Joshua Heikkila, said throughout his high school education, he grew and learned to look at people openly. He added, people have special talents that make them great." I wonder if Josh looked hard enough to see anything good about his own brother. One of Joshua's favorite quotes was printed in the yearbook under his senior picture, and it said, One ought every day at least once to hear a little song, read a good poem, see a fine picture, and if possible, to speak a few reasonable words. Matt's was, sometimes you have to lose to win. When Matt was 18, he was arrested after he tried to impersonate a police officer. He grabbed someone at the mall, put their hands behind their back, and handcuffed them. That same year, he faced contempt of court charges, and 1 year later, at only 19, he already had several warrants out for vehicular violations. The fact that the Heikkilas knew Matt was jealous and felt like he was second best led them to overcompensate. They hardly ever punished him for his bad behavior, thinking he was just acting out because he needed more attention. Instead of disciplining him, they would almost praise him after these incidents. For that moment when he was in trouble, he would get his parents' full attention. They couldn't just ignore him when the police were standing at their door. Things started to really go downhill for Matt after high school. He was still living at home, but didn't follow any rules. He'd be out all night partying and taking drugs, specifically Valium in large doses, possibly to numb his pain and forget that he didn't belong. Matthew's relationships with women were also out of control. He had a huge issue with abandonment, and if a woman tried to dump him, he would become unhinged. He would threaten to take his own life or even theirs. Women felt trapped. They didn't want to be with him once they noticed his true colors, but they were too terrified to leave. Matt had the ability to fake being very friendly at first, and the fact that he came from a wealthy family helped because he would buy them gifts and take them on trips, often using his family's credit card without their permission. Most of the time, Matt did not have his own money. He just jumped from one odd job to the next. Meanwhile, Josh was applying to Ivy League colleges and getting his father's praise and attention all the time. This, of course, caused Matt to have a growing hatred towards Richard. In the summer of 1988, the family gathered around the dinner table. Dawn walked over and handed Josh an envelope addressed to him from Dartmouth. He had applied months earlier, and they were about to find out if he got in. It was an exciting moment in Josh's life, and for anyone who worked as hard as he did. It was also an exciting moment for his parents. Matt just couldn't let Josh enjoy this moment. He kept telling him to open the stupid envelope already and made rude remarks like, "It's not a big deal. Why would anyone want to go there anyway? I hate school. We all know Mr. Perfect got into Dartmouth, so why are we even standing around like it's some kind of big surprise? Just open it up so we can move on and eat." Super rude and inconsiderate, of course. His parents were excited for Josh and wouldn't let Matt ruin that moment. Josh did get accepted, and they all cheered, so happy for him. Except for Matt, who sat there stone cold. Instead of being happy for his brother, he turned around and stormed off. In the summer of 1989, when Matt was 19, he started dating a girl from Ecuador. By November, he asked her to marry him. She said that she had to ask her parents for permission, so he used his parents' credit card, and they took a trip to Ecuador. However, his girlfriend's parents forbade her to marry Matt after finding out he had lied about his age. He claimed he was 24 when he was only 19. Matt was livid. Instead of dealing with his emotions in a mature, healthy manner, he reacted poorly. Matt tried to take his life by swallowing painkillers and shooting Valium into his veins. He was rushed to the hospital, and they ended up saving his life. He flew home, and guess who was waiting for him at the airport? Dawn and Richard. They checked him in at Overlook Hospital for treatments, but he escaped. A nurse was trying to stick a syringe into his arm, and he violently ripped it out and ran. That night, he never came home. He slept over at a friend's house, and he was running with a bad crowd, so he was back abusing drugs. His drug abuse ended up leading to full-on hallucinations. He was super paranoid, and he told doctors and his family that a Colombian drug dealer was after him. This is what led him to purchase a handgun for protection. He paid $650 for a Beretta. Here he is, mentally unstable, and now he has a weapon. Not a good combo. On December 3, 1989, Matt called the Bernards Township police, saying that someone was after him. The police called Richard and told him, "You need to come home and tend to your son." His dad was super embarrassed because, at this point, Dawn and Richard were prominent figures in their community. Most people in the neighborhood did not like Matt. They got a bad feeling about him. They knew he was unstable, but it was hard because they liked the Heikkilas. Therefore, they were willing to accept Matt and, pretend there wasn't something wrong with him. Dawn was working for Bergdorf Realtors as a top saleswoman. She was also a member of the state's $1 Million Sales Club. Everyone seemed to know her because she sold most of the families their homes in Basking Ridge. At this point, Richard was highly respected. He was revolutionizing the research and treatment for Parkinson's disease. He, alongside his research team, produced extremely important studies that are still being used today. At the time, they were on the cutting edge of discovering what causes Parkinson's and how to treat it, and even close to possibly finding a cure. Richard truly was leading the research in these areas. Ironically, he was also studying brain injuries suffered by drug users. Yet, here he was, put off by Matt's addiction, and didn't want it to reflect poorly upon him, especially because he had just recently taken a position as a professor of neurology and pharmacology at the research institution. So he was new to this position and didn't want anything to tarnish his name. Dawn was always patient with Matt, but over the years, Richard had had enough. He came home from work that afternoon and confronted Matt about calling the police and his claims of being stalked. This is the moment Richard found out that Matt had a gun. Earlier that morning, Matt was rummaging through the house. He was looking for cash and credit cards and ended up stumbling upon a letter that was in Josh's room. It was written by his mother and sent to Josh last summer when Josh went away to summer camp. The minute Richard walked through the door, and before he could confront Matt about the call, Matt cornered him in the kitchen and was yelling at him over this letter. He insisted the letter proved everything he had suspected, that they loved and cared about Josh way more than him. His father told him not to be ridiculous. It was merely a letter, and had Matt been away at summer camp, they would have written him a letter too. Instead, Matt chose to be out getting in trouble, and it was his actions that put him in the position he was in. But Matt never took responsibility. He blamed his parents for everything that went wrong, and his life in this moment was no different. He starts reading the letter out loud to his father, and he did it in this condescending manner. "Dear Josh, your father and I want you to know we are so happy that you made National Honor Society." So, anytime Richard tried to interrupt and explain away each part of the letter, Matt would yell at him to shut up. He would move closer and closer to Richard, and he just kept reading the letter. "But what we're most proud of is the fact that you're turning out to be a caring, responsible, and kind person." As Matt was reading the letter, his anger was getting more and more out of control, and he moved closer and closer. He got right up into his dad's face, and he was so close he was spitting on his dad while he was yelling. Richard was trying to keep calm, and Matt just kept saying, "You don't love me. You don't care about me. You never had." And he wanted Richard to say to his face, to finally admit he didn't love Matt. Instead, Richard was still trying to tell him how much they did love him. It didn't help. Matt grew increasingly irritated, and he kept screaming in Richard's face to stop interrupting him. That's when he pulled out the Beretta. He pointed it at Richard and screamed for him to shut up and listen. Richard put his hand up in front of his face and said, Okay, I'm listening. Please stop," he said. "I love you. Your mother loves you. Josh loves you." But right when Richard uttered the name Josh, Matt cocked the gun and came closer to him. He told him, "If you say the name Josh one more time, I will blow your head off." Richard told him he would never say it again. Then Matt took the gun and started to point it at himself and threatened to take his own life. Richard saw this opportunity to grab the cordless phone that was sitting on the kitchen counter, and he called 911. Matt was still screaming at the top of his lungs and saying how embarrassing it would be for the community to find out that Matt took his life because his family never loved him. Richard was on the phone with a 911 operator, and he was quickly trying to tell the operator that his son had a gun and was threatening him. All the while, the operator could hear Matt in the background. They could hear Matt asking his dad how it would feel if he blew his head off, and the family would have to sit down in this kitchen, knowing that his brains had been scattered all over the place. He once again pointed the gun at Richard, but heard the operator say that the police would be there any minute. Matt was no stranger to the police, so he gave up and walked away. Richard was still on the phone, and he was scared that Matt really was going to take his own life, so he started chasing after him. Matt made it to the front door, and all of a sudden, you hear shots ringing out, one after the other, after the other. Richard was sure that Matt was dead, so he yelled into the phone, "Send paramedics." When he got outside, he saw Matt shooting up the Toyota Corolla that they had purchased for him when he turned 16. Matt ended up putting 13 bullets into his own car. He was arrested and taken into custody, and the Heikkilas begged the police not to charge him with anything. Instead, they said, "Please admit him to the Carrier Clinic, a private psychiatric hospital. But against his parents' wishes, the police charged him with making terroristic threats against Richard, and bail was set at $25,000. Get this. His parents, of course, bailed him out, but then they actually hired a defense attorney to help get the charges dismissed and prove drug-induced insanity. It worked. Of course it did. When you have the money and can afford a good defense attorney, sometimes you can get away with things. When he was in the institution, he admitted to Dr. Sadoff that when he went back to Ecuador, he watched the movie Back to the Future, and this is when he thought that Arab terrorists were coming after him, driving a Volkswagen minibus. And that's what set all this into motion. I wanted to laugh, but then I have to stop and remind myself that this is real to Matthew. As much as it seems funny to us, when an individual is having these delusional hallucinations, it is real to them. The agreement with the court was if he could stay off drugs and continue counseling, he could be released. The doctor told his parents that his prognosis would be good if he could stay away from street drugs. Matt was released after 6 weeks. His parents thought perhaps getting a job would encourage him to change and bring in some extra money for him to attempt to support himself and move on in life. This way, he would become a stable adult. But the added pressure of holding down a job and the rules that it entailed put him into another tailspin. One afternoon, his parents found him unresponsive on the floor of his bedroom. This time they admitted him to Somerset Medical Center, and he stayed there for 2 weeks. After this episode, he told doctors he didn't remember anything, including when he threatened his dad with the Beretta. Doctors told his parents that he may have carried out some of his actions because he had psychotic paranoid delusions plus auditory hallucinations. He couldn't think clearly. He wasn't a healthy, rational person. He did not understand or appreciate the danger of his actions because of his paranoid fears. I always think it must be scary for someone to almost be trapped inside their mind, to not know that they're not stable, to be living in this alternate reality. Doctors said that Matt should be treated as mentally ill and be prescribed antipsychotic medications, rather than trying to treat him as a criminal. They said he should not be allowed to possess any substances or weapons, since his actions were not based in reality. The doctors feared he was going to fatally hurt someone or himself. It seemed like the Heikkilas didn't heed this warning. In the next few weeks, the clinic had let them know no one was making sure that Matt stayed on track. No one was monitoring him or whether he was attending the clinic for routine treatment and staying off drugs. On one hand, I'm sitting here thinking, yes, his parents should have been on top of that, but he's an adult. However, he's also classified as mentally ill. So does that mean he falls back under his parents' responsibility? Doctors weren't the only ones who warned the Heikkila family that Matt was capable of fatally injuring someone. Police told Richard after the incident with the Beretta that he had to follow through and do something with a more severe punishment, like jail, or Matt was going to kill you both. Neither parent believed that. They thought he just needed to learn a little more responsibility. So, with his parents' help and their connections in the community, he landed a pretty decent job as a desk clerk at the Madison Hotel in Bernards Township. They even bought him a brand new Jeep so he could drive there for his shifts. But a couple of weeks later, he totaled it, flipped it while he was speeding. It frustrates me. I can't help it. Nevertheless, considering some of the other bad things that had happened before, things started to seem like they were looking up. Matt was on a pretty normal schedule. He was waking up on his own, going to work, meeting new people, making new friends, and he was also dating again. He was with 19-year-old Melanie Glover, who was from about an hour away in Long Branch. Not sure where they met, but in the fall of 1990, she got pregnant. The problem was, Matt was being unfaithful. He was seeing another girl that he was working with at the hotel in October. Her name was Marta Morales, and we will talk about her in a moment. He told his pregnant girlfriend, Melanie, that he was in love with someone else, saying, "You can keep the baby, but I'm out of here." Who was this new girl, Marta, that he was in love with? She was a lovely girl. Her mother was an immigrant from Mexico, very hardworking, and she taught Marta to do the same. She was smart and was attending St. Elizabeth's University, a private Catholic school in Bernards Township, on a scholarship. Marta was so happy dating Matt. He was her first serious boyfriend. She even introduced him to her mother, which was a pretty big deal. And her mom thought he was a really nice boy, but hoped Matt wouldn't be a distraction from her studies. Marta's mother was very strict, and for whatever reason, that made an impression on Matt. He always acted very respectfully towards Marta's mom, and it wasn't an act. He actually held her in high regard. He didn't want to make any mistakes, especially because he was in love with her daughter. He always had Marta home on time and spoiled her with gifts. She really thought she had found the one, a man who was going to help her achieve her goal of living the American dream. The Heikkilas were also very happy. They really thought Matt was on the straight and narrow until one afternoon in mid-December 1990. Richard received a call from the Bernards Township Police Department. They informed Richard that Matt had stolen $900 from the hotel and had just been fired. He was charged with theft, and they were holding him until Richard picked him up from the police station. Richard couldn't believe it because, unlike Dawn, he doubted Matt would ever be able to live a life void of trouble. When Richard came to get Matt, Matt claimed he didn't do it, that the hotel didn't like him, and they were pinning this on him to get rid of him. The Heikkilas said, "We do not care. You're going to have to get another job because you need to pay back the hotel for what you did." That was perfect because he needed extra money anyway. Christmas was getting closer, and Matt had been promising Marta they would spend the night in a 5-star hotel, order room service in the morning, and he'd get her any gift she wanted. He didn't have enough money, so he asked his mom if he could borrow some. She agreed and asked him, "How much do you need? Is $100 enough?" Matt just laughed hysterically. "Mom, come on, it's more like a couple of thousand," he said. His mom was shocked. She said, "I can't do that. It's far too much to spend on a girl you've just started dating a couple of months ago." Besides, she mentioned Richard would find out. What do you think happens? Matt goes ballistic. He's screaming at Dawn, asking her why she's so scared of Richard. He tells her, "Think for yourself. Stop letting him make decisions for you." Matt had no choice but to take a job as a cashier at a gas station, which was 30 minutes outside of his community where he wasn't well known. Can you guess? Yeah, it didn't last long. On Christmas Eve, only a couple of weeks into his night shift, he was apprehended by Summit police. He was questioned in connection to a report from the owner that he stole $3,000 from the safe, as well as a recent break-in at a home nearby. I guess he was trying to get that money for Marta's presents. This time, Matt was held in jail for over 10 hours until his parents came to bail him out. Richard wanted to teach Matt a lesson, but Dawn kept begging to go get him. When the police led Matt out to see his parents, Richard didn't even know what to say. He was speechless. Finally, he said to Matt, "You committed a felony, and it carries a 5-year prison sentence." Matt laughed, sarcastically responding with, Yeah, Dad, but you have one thing wrong. I had nothing to do with it." He's always blaming everything on other people, but he insisted if Richard would just take a look at the facts, instead of listening to the false narratives that cops were trying to spin about him, then maybe Richard would see that Matt was innocent. Richard couldn't take it anymore. He was just so damn condescending, and it's frustrating that he won't just act like an adult. Richard started to become angry, raising his voice right inside the police headquarters. He said, "I am looking at the facts, and the fact is you are always getting in trouble." Dawn jumped up, getting right in the middle of both of them. She looked at Richard and told him to stop it. Then she put her hands around Matt's face, stroking his cheek and comforting him, saying, "I'm so sorry you had to spend so many hours in jail." While she was doing this, Matt looked over at his dad and said, "Yeah, Dad, don't you care that I've been locked up for so long for something I didn't do? Why are some people just so easy to want to punch in the face?" Dawn was hugging Matt, and she said, "Honey, do you want to go back to Somerset? That was the psychiatric facility." Matt just lashed out at her, accusing her of saying he's crazy. He said, "Are you just trying to send me back to some kind of insane asylum and lock me up forever so you can forget about me and enjoy your life with your real son, Josh?" It was extremely frustrating because Matt was always misinterpreting things. He just angers me so much. Matt figured he would make up for his inability to wine and dine Marta for Christmas and told her he would spoil her for her 20th birthday, which was on January 29th. The plan was for Marta to go to Mexico, visit with her family a couple of weeks before, then come back and celebrate together. Marta went away and Matt was a wreck. He kept calling and calling and calling, not leaving her alone. She's out enjoying time with her cousins and her friends on her vacation, and he just would not let up, constantly accusing her of sleeping with other men. But the truth was, she lost her virginity to Matt. Oh, and he took pride in that. He would bring it up again and again, almost using it against her, kind of like he owned her. On January 10th, he hangs up on her. He called her a name and once again accused her of being unfaithful. He goes out and purchases a double-barrel 20-gauge shotgun. The next day, he drove over an hour to Melanie's, his pregnant ex's house, and he begs her to marry him. Is this as confusing to you? Because to me he has this huge fear of abandonment, so much so that he goes back to his ex while assuming Marta is cheating, only for Melanie to completely turn him down. So he goes back to the car, grabs the shotgun, points it in her face and tells her, "You better get an abortion and never tell anyone that we dated or I'll kill you." Unbelievable. Marta returned the following week, and Matt acted like nothing happened, like he didn't call her names, and he just apologizes for accusing her of cheating. He just says, "I just love you so much. It's so hard for me for you to be away. It just makes me crazy." And he's so sorry. Marta hadn't dated before, so she had no experience and didn't know what love was. This wasn't love, it was abuse. He was so manipulative, so much so the next time she was over, he shows her the shotgun and tells her, "If you ever leave me, I'll blow my head off." I cannot imagine the fear and guilt that I'd be carrying around, thinking I may be the reason someone that I love takes their life. That's a big burden for a young girl, or just anyone to have to bear. On Monday, January 28, Marta was worried. She calls Dawn and explains she's concerned for Matt. He's been locked up in his room the whole weekend. He's probably on drugs, and he could hurt himself. She doesn't tell his mom about the shotgun, though. Maybe she would have taken it just a tad more seriously had Marta admitted that. Dawn attempts to talk to Matt through the door, but he tells her he just needs to get a gift for Marta. It's her birthday, and he didn't have any money, and he needed to borrow some, so he's back with this again. Dawn gave him the same answer as last time, and she left for work. The next morning, Dawn knocked on the door to his room once again to check on him. This time, she could hear him crying. He was more vulnerable, and he begs her to stay with him. He says he needs her. He's so depressed. He's scared that he might do something stupid and hurt himself. Instead of stopping everything and giving Matt attention, she tells him she's going to be late to a meeting with a client, so she's got to hurry and leave. Matt's emotions are all over the place. He's mad, he's sad, he feels abandoned once again. He's trapped and doesn't know what to do. He doesn't have money, he's depressed, everything is becoming too much. Not all of us have the same coping skills. Matt goes to the window and he's just watching his mother drive away, thinking that she doesn't really love him. Work was more important than her son. One person cared though, Marta, and today was her 20th birthday, January 29, 1991. He decides to cheer up and keep his promise. He got excited for what the night would bring. There was one problem. He didn't have money or a car, but he thought of a plan to get what he wanted. Matt made reservations at the famous Windows of the World restaurant, located on the 107th floor atop the World Trade Center in New York City. He calls Marta and tells her he would pick her up at 7 o'clock. Look how breathtaking this restaurant was. To think that it all fell to the ground on September 11th is so sad. The dinners here were from $30 to $50, not including dessert or anything else you wanted, and it definitely wasn't cheap. As honored as Marta was when she realized where Matt had taken her, she kept asking how in the world he was able to afford this. He just smiles and tells her she's worth it. He's complimenting her excessively about how beautiful she looked and how gorgeous she was. But then he brings up the cheating. In such a beautiful moment, he just can't help himself. It catches Marta off guard. She's instantly annoyed and upset and frustrated, and she once again tries to explain to him she did not cheat. She looks him in the eye and tells him, "You just imagined all that. It never happened." I'm sure he did not like that. Only Matt's reality matters though. He goes on to tell her that he can't be away from her. She's just so gorgeous. Then, in a manipulative manner, he says, "What do you expect? Do you blame me for not wanting to lose you?" And this puts it back on her. It can make you feel guilty for getting upset, so he transfers the blame once again. They're getting ready to leave, and he tells her he has one more surprise for her, and that this one is really going to blow her mind. She is so excited she can't wait. She already feels like a princess. They finally get in the car. Marta can't wait to get her surprise. It's around 11 o'clock when they pull up to Matt's house, and she's never been over this late before, so she's scared that his parents are gonna see them, sneaking in. Matt assures her she doesn't have to worry about his parents. He tells her to close her eyes, take his hand, not to peek, and follow him upstairs. They get up to the second floor where the rec room was, and Matt told Marta she could look now. It was dim in the room, and at first Marta didn't see anything. She looks over at Matt, puzzled, but then she follows his gaze to the floor, and that's when she saw it. Her brain couldn't process what her eyes were looking at. She can't contain herself, and she lets out this blood-curdling scream. It's a scream of horror and disgust and disbelief because there, on the rec room floor, is Matt's mother, or at this point, what's left of Matt's mother. She was completely unrecognizable. Her lifeless body is covered in blood, and Marta is so confused. So she's looking at Matt, and she's screaming, "That's your mother, Matt! Oh my God!" And he's just staring blankly ahead like catatonic, and he says, "It is. Are you surprised? That's what a shotgun does to your head." Boom. Bye-bye, Mom. Matt started to walk towards Marta, and he says, "What's wrong, baby? Don't you like it? Well, don't worry. I have another surprise waiting for you." He didn't want her to run, so he took out a pair of handcuffs. He gets one handcuff on her, but she runs. She tries to make her way out from the basement, and that's when she saw Matt's father. His overcoat was still on. He never had a chance to make it all the way inside the house before Matt shot him in the back of the head with the same sawed-off shotgun he used on Dawn. Marta is stunned. She's hyperventilating, she's trapped, she's sick to her stomach, she's gagging, and she's completely terrified. I can't imagine realizing that the person I thought I loved is an evil, heartless maniac, and all along I thought he would be my future. It would be as if my future was flashing before my eyes and out like a light. She screamed and screamed. She was shaking on the floor. At this point, he starts making fun of Richard as he's lying there. His life was stolen from him after all he had given Matt, and he's mocking him. It hurts for me to even repeat this, but he was saying things like, "Who's the boss now, Dad? You're not so powerful and smart anymore, are you?" Then he turns and looks straight at Marta and says, "You're next." She makes it upstairs, and he pushes her into Josh's room. He throws her on the bed, and he tells her he can't possibly let her go after all she has seen. Then he looks at her with these black, evil, blank eyes. He tells her there are a lot of reasons she needs to die tonight. One is that she's a liar. He loved her, but she never loved him. He wanted her to say it, to say that she loved him, to beg for her life. She was too stunned to even speak, and he just kept going, just screaming in her face, spitting on her as he yelled at her. He told her this would never have happened if she hadn't cheated on him. She tried again to defend herself, but there was no arguing or reasoning with a murderous sociopath. He has to be right, and the more you try to deny his reality, the angrier he becomes. He says there's no other excuse for her not answering the phone at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. Where was she? Where could she have been? He's holding onto her arms, shaking her. She's bawling, shaking, nauseous, and she is in utter shock. She's trying to get the courage to mutter, "I was sleeping, Matt," but he's got a one-track mind, and the only thing that's on it is murder. I feel so bad for her. He tells her none of them loved him, that they're all liars. He opens up his closet, reaches inside, and pulls out the shotgun. He points it at her. She's crawling across the bed. He comes towards her slowly, the gun held right in her face. He told her he wanted her to die with good memories, and that's why he took her out to a nice time, knowing that it would be her very last night on Earth. She was begging him to spare her life. She told him, "I love you so much, so much. Even after everything I saw, I still love you." All the while she is saying this with a shotgun in her face at point-blank range. This woman is so strong. She is so courageous. To think she had to use all the strength in her not to look like she was lying. She knew she had one chance to try to save herself. She slowly puts her hands up in front of her face, while tears are just still running right down her cheeks, and she just softly asks him to please put the gun down and talk to her. There was just this silence. He stood there in silence. Imagine not knowing what this man is going to do to you. How much time do you have left? To her surprise, he slowly let the weapon fall to the floor. Then he sits down next to her on the bed. At this point, he asks her to put her arms out straight in front of her. Of course, she complies, and he handcuffs her right arm to his left arm. She can't escape. He proceeds to tell her that after everything he's accomplished that day, he's exhausted and needs to get some sleep. This poor young girl has been tricked, lied to, manipulated, and has just witnessed not one but two deceased people. She was almost killed, and now she has to sleep with the man responsible. She knew this. For now, she was still alive, even if it meant she only had one more hour on this earth. Even if it was just to feel the warmth of a bed for the very last time, or smell her perfume, or look around at this gorgeous home that became an early grave for Matt's parents. Anything was worth having more time, even pretending to love a monster. He turned the lights out, shotgun by his side, pulled the covers over them, cuddled up next to her, and fell right to sleep. Not Marta. She had to use all of her strength not to scream, cry, or try to run because our instinct is to survive, to retreat. But she had to be smart. She couldn't relax. There was no way she could sleep. She thought he could wake up at any moment, and that would be the end. All night, She's thinking of a way to convince Matt not to take her life. She knew what he was capable of. The next morning, Matt wakes up. He leans over toward her and unlocks the handcuffs. Obviously, they have to wash up. They have to go to the bathroom. He needs to as well. Just as she's walking toward the bathroom, he says, "Marta, don't do anything stupid." She can't help it though. As soon as she gets out of his sight, she locks the bathroom door behind her and falls to the ground on that cold tile and just hysterically cries. She also knows she can't waste any time. She's looking all over the room for a weapon or a way out. There's a window above the toilet, but it's pretty high up. She closes the lid and steps on top, stretching to reach the windowsill. She's pulling herself up high enough to reach the shutters. They have a latch on them, so she lowers herself back down and tries again. This time, she unhooks the latch. These shutters swing open so fast that they crash against the wall, making a really loud noise, and she knows Matt heard it. She can hear him somewhere in the bedroom, so she knows if he finds out that she's trying to escape, it is over. She tries to pull herself up again to get to the windowsill, but she slips. It's too far. She can't reach it. She can't balance and try to open at the same time. At that moment, he bangs on the door. She nearly falls on her face. He asks, "What's taking you so long?" She says, "I'm just using the toilet," so he tells her to hurry up. Now she realizes there is no way to escape. She has to walk out there and face him once again. She has a plan. She's hoping it's not too late to try one last thing. As soon as she comes out, she pretends to be happy to see him. She tells him how thankful she is that he took her to such a fabulous dinner and that she had the best birthday, pretending she doesn't even remember the other things that occurred that night. His face lights up. It's working. She tells him, "I'm so lucky to have you. You know, we should get away together." He stops and looks at her and he's like, "What do you mean we?" She repeats, "We together. Let's just get out of here. Let's fly to Jamaica." Jamaica was a place that Matt really enjoyed. He had stolen his dad's credit cards in the past and stayed there for a while. She tells him that no one will find them there and they can start a new life together. So, Marta tells him that no one will know them there. They can hurry and leave, starting a brand new life, just the two of them. He is standing there silently, staring at her for what seems like forever. Then he leans in and says, "Okay, we'll leave right now. We'll get to the airport and catch the very first flight out of here to Jamaica." Marta is trying to hold in her excitement because she can't believe it. She doesn't trust it yet because at any moment this could be another lie, another way to manipulate her, another way to trick her into thinking he may actually be a normal, kind, loving man. But she takes comfort in what he says for the moment because remember, she's still alive. For now, this buys her more time to figure out how to escape from this psycho. He tells her if she runs, he will kill her without a second of hesitation. She assures him she doesn't want to leave him and can't wait to start their new life together. That's survival right there. There's only one issue. Marta obviously didn't come prepared for a trip out of the country. She doesn't have her passport. She's so terrified, she has to tell Matt they need to stop by her house so she can run up to her room and get it, and then they can be on their way. Even if she's scared, that's the truth. His mood has changed, and she's shocked when he actually agrees. He seems happy, excited, and he's back to normal, whatever that means. They leave. 45 minutes later, they arrive at Marta's around 8 o'clock in the morning. Matt parks his mom's car, they get out, and he follows her inside. This evil man is only one step behind her. Remember, she hasn't been home all night since he picked her up over 12 hours ago. She hasn't spoken to her parents, nothing. When her mom hears them come through the door, of course, she rushes over to speak with them. Marta is terrified. If her parents get in Matt's way, he will do the same thing he did to his own parents, probably without even a moment of hesitation. She almost screams, but she knows she has to hold it together for the sake of her mother. He's already mouthing to her to keep her mouth shut. She tries to act completely normal. Matt was actually hoping Marta's parents wouldn't be home. He didn't want to have this confrontation. Remember that he respects Marta's mom. He doesn't want to look bad. His reputation still matters to him. Oddly and ironically, he's actually scared of Marta's mom. She's only 4'11". He's got a weapon in his car 50 feet away, but he stops in his tracks. She's also able to tell that something is not right. There is an unspoken message of fear and concern. With her motherly instincts, she could probably smell the tension in that room. She starts to yell at Marta. She asks her, "What are you doing home? You have class. Where were you all night? Why didn't you ever come home?" She turns to Matt and says, "Matthew, what is going on here? What are you doing here at this hour on a school day?" He's in his delusional state and starts telling Marta's mom that they're actually going on a birthday trip to Jamaica to celebrate Marta's birthday. She looks at him like he has 5 heads. She's like, "What? You cannot be serious, Matt." She begins to approach him. She's fearless, but then again, she has no idea what he has just done and how close she could be to death. She tells him to go home and tells Marta to go upstairs. Marta is just standing there trying to plead with her, but she's stern. She turns back to Matt once again and tells him it's time for him to leave. Marta knows that any second Matt is going to lose it. Her heart is pounding because she can see his jaw tightening up, his fists rolled up into balls, his eyes piercing through her mother. Time seems to be going by so slowly until Matt lets out a breath and says, "Fine, I'll go." Shocked, Marta watches him start to turn around. Then he stops. He comes back over to her and whispers in her ear, "I should have blown your head off when I had the chance," then turns back around and swiftly walks right out the door. I'm shocked too, but what might not be apparent is that Matt wasn't used to someone challenging him. His parents never stood up to him like that. Matt could easily manipulate everyone around him, but inside, he was truly a weak coward. He was no mental match for Marta's mom. As soon as the door closes, Marta falls to the ground, hysterically crying. Her mom shuts the door and locks it. Marta can't breathe, can't get out a word. She's absolutely inconsolable. But before she can even tell her mom what happened, the phone rings, and Marta jumps up, startled. She lets out a scream and runs to pick it up. She knew it was Matt from his mother's car phone outside. He threatens to kill her and her whole family if they call the police. She stays quiet, lies to her mom, and says they broke up, which is why she's so upset. That day was Wednesday, and while all of this is going on, a few of Dawn's co-workers notice that she's late to a meeting with one of her clients. They try to call her on the car phone, and that's when they knew something wasn't right because Matt was forbidden to drive his mother's new Audi. Matt makes up a story, saying Josh has been in a terrible car accident and the whole family was driving to the university right now. Her co-workers were not buying it. Remember, people knew Matt wasn't well. They weren't stupid. They didn't like him. They drive over to the house, and a note is on the door with the same message in Matt's handwriting. It just seemed off. Why wouldn't the Heikkilas just call and explain? The friends called the police, and then the police also called the university to find out what's going on. What's crazy is that Josh was supposed to be on his way home the day before. Yeah, wow. The police were now inside the Heikkilas' house, where they discovered the carnage at 2:20 p.m. Matt was nowhere to be found. What was found were 2 shotgun shells, etched into their soft metal with precision, with the word Mom on one of them and Dad on the other. You cannot say after seeing that this was not premeditated. I'm going to tell you more of the details about what exactly happened later. Marta had stayed quiet, like Matt requested, and it wasn't until an APB was put out for Matt that a police officer recognized him and knew that he was dating Marta. He alerts the police, and they arrive at her house and attempt to question her, but at first she wouldn't speak. I probably wouldn't either. She couldn't speak. She was still in shock. They didn't know what happened to her. They had no idea what she had been through, and they didn't find out until she felt safe. They told her, "There are a ton of police cars outside. You're gonna be okay." She finally admits to them what happened that night, and then she says, "He's probably on his way to Jamaica." On Thursday morning, police locate the 1989 Audi at Newark International Airport. Later, they traced Matt's movements to a small town 60 miles away from Montego Bay. He had checked into a very small bed and breakfast called Miss Mary's Place. It did take 6 days, though, for Jamaican police to locate him, and by then, he had already settled down into his new life. He had been shopping, eating at nice restaurants, even grabbed drinks with a few women, all on his dead father's dime. Unfortunately for him, he left a really bad impression the last time he was there, and a cop remembered him from a moped accident when he saw the federal warrant out for his arrest. Now, he alerted the FBI, and they busted into Matt's hotel room and apprehended him on February 15, 1991. Somerset County Grand Jury indicted Matt, only 22 years old, on capital murder charges for the deaths of his parents, as well as kidnapping and attempted murder of Marta. He was in jail pending a $2.5 million bail. His poor parents were not there to bail him out this time. Both Josh and Marta were now in protective custody. As his trial began on November 12, 1992, a lot of details started to emerge, and I will share many of them with you. There was no question that Matt had killed his parents, but there was one thing that remained at issue, and that was whether he was insane or not. This was the same court and the same judge, Michael R. Imbriani, that found Matt not guilty by reason of insanity only a year earlier when he threatened to shoot his dad with the Beretta. Now what if Matt had actually followed through? Wouldn't that mean his insanity was the cause? That's what the defense said. Shortly before his court appearance, Matt said he felt absolutely terrible for what happened. He wished he could talk to his parents. He said, "I was going to call my mom, but then I realized I couldn't. When I sit down and think about it, I freak out and my emotions run wild." Do you believe him? He also began writing letters while he was in jail. He wrote them to Josh, Marta, and also various news outlets. In one of the letters, which was for Fox News, he stated, "I guess the reason I did not kill Marta was because I did not have any shells left. I would have shot her in the stomach so I could watch her die a slow and painful death. She deserved it." Why does this young girl deserve that? Because he really thinks that she cheated on him. Even if she did, really? Then he goes on to brag about the fact that he once escaped a prison sentence because of being legally insane, and he was going to do it again. The jury was made up of 9 men and 3 women. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty because they claimed Matt ambushed his parents while robbing them, allegedly to attain the money in the car to take Marta out for her birthday. If that's not insane, I don't know what is. But aside from the legalities, everyone who knew Matt and his history knew this was not just about wanting to take his girlfriend out. The prosecution still needed a motive to get beyond the insanity defense, so they decided to claim felony murder, committing a homicide during a dangerous felony such as robbery, rape, arson, or kidnapping. This would justify the death penalty. It was better for the prosecution if the motive was money and not hatred for his adoptive parents, because then all the anticipated psychological testimony from the expert witnesses and counselors that treated Matt would become relevant. Circling back to the insanity plea. At trial, the details emerged. There was a videotape of the crime scene submitted as evidence, played for the entire courtroom. It was said to be surreal, like a home movie. It started with the beautiful suburban home, unwashed dishes in the sink, sports trophies lining the walls, and holiday decorations still here and there. Then the camera panned over to 2 dead bodies. There were also very graphic and up-close photos of the victims, including one of Dawn, that many people who loved her could not look at. It was so gruesome that you couldn't even make out what you were looking at. It just seemed like a whole bunch of raw meat. Only a third of her skull was left, and it was said that because of the damage, she was shot at point-blank range. It was also revealed that Matt had named the shotgun LB, short for Left Behind. The symbolism there is chilling. Police had found an undated handwritten note from Matt. The note said he originally planned to kill his girlfriend and then commit suicide, and that Marta wanted to die, and once she did, he couldn't go on. He explained this was a pact and this was a goodbye letter. He apparently tore up the letter and threw it away, but since it was eventually found in Dawn's things, the theory was she had found it, confronted him, and that's what led to the Heikkila's deaths. The last words he said to each of his parents were, "I hate you," before pulling the trigger. He explained that he lured his parents home by telling them he was dating 2 women and got one of them pregnant, and he didn't know what to do. His mom arrived first, and he was hiding upstairs, waiting for her to come in looking for him, and that's when he ambushed her. His father came home later. Just 30 minutes later, Matt came up behind his father and ambushed him as well. Matthew also blamed the legal system for not giving him the treatment he needed after being found not guilty by reason of insanity in 1989. At one point, he even said, "I'm not a violent person." He told the judge that no one monitored him to make sure he was following through with his treatment plan, arguing, "If you would have followed through on the treatment plan, I would still have my family." He was literally blaming the judge. The court stated that it was Matt's responsibility to follow the court order, and he chose not to. It wasn't Richard and Dawn's fault. They did everything they could for Matthew. It wasn't a lack of love or trying on their part. The sole defense witness was a psychiatrist named Harry Brunt, who said that Matt was insane at the time of the killings and did not know right from wrong. He argued that Matt did not receive proper care growing up. Psychiatrist Kenneth Weiss rebutted this, saying that Matt did not have a mental illness but rather antisocial personality disorder. He argued that the insanity plea did not apply. Recall that Matt's parents were the ones to argue the insanity plea, not wanting him to get in trouble. However, the incident with his father was caused by his severe jealousy of Josh and his perceived inferiority to his whole family, corroborated by evidence. The jury did not buy the defense's arguments, finding Matthew guilty of 12 counts, including murder, kidnapping, robbery, making terroristic threats, and unlawful possession of a weapon. On January 14, 1993, Matthew learned that he would be facing the death penalty. Despite this, he believed his appeal would be successful, stating, "I will not die behind bars." During the penalty phase, the jury was left to decide whether Matthew would spend the rest of his life in prison or receive lethal injection. Judge Imbriani allowed testimony about adopted child syndrome, with a psychologist stating that Matt fit the profile, an adopted child filled with rage who doesn't have the opportunity to vent his feelings to his family. I feel like that's all he was ever doing. I'm going to define adopted child syndrome for you. It was very difficult for me to find a reputable source to truly understand what this was, so I'm using the best source I could find, the Journals of Contemporary Social Sciences. Adopted child syndrome has repeatedly surfaced to explain behaviors in adopted children that seem uniquely related to their adoptive status. Specifically, these include problems with bonding, attachment disorders, lying, stealing, defiance of authority, and acts of violence. The term really hasn't achieved acceptance within the professional community though, because there is a lack of data. There is a quote from Adopted Forensics by Dr. David Kirshner, PhD, that says, of the 500 estimated serial killers in the United States, 16 were adopted as children. He found that adoptees were 15 times more likely to kill one or both of their adoptive parents than biological children. So, there's that. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury sentenced him to 2 30-year terms with no possibility of parole. I thought it was odd that 10 out of 12 were voting in favor of the state's theory that Matt killed his father to cover up the murder of his mother. And then a lot of the people on the jury agreed with the defense as well, that he really did have issues from his past and being adopted, whether we think they're rational or not. It was clear he had issues with it. So on Thursday, February 25, 1993, Matthew was called a danger to others by the judge and ordered to be kept in prison until the age of 80. Judge Michael Imbriani stated, "Colt calculated and premeditated murders committed less than 1 hour apart of the two people who gave you more love than anyone else on this earth. They wanted you to cease acting like a spoiled child, to stop mooching off of their hard-earned money, and to start standing on your own 2 feet as an adult. You showed your appreciation by murdering them." Matt is serving the rest of his life sentence in Kentucky State Reformatory. He will turn 51 this year. Apparently, after being sentenced to life in prison, Matthew did find his birth parents, but he does go by a new last name. Maybe it's his biological parents' last name. He has a prison pen pal account if you do want to write him, and he says he's been a dog trainer since 2008 and he's in the process of completing his master's degree and will go on to pursue a PhD. He's a hopeless optimist who hopes to find someone who can accept him for who he is, not who he was years ago. But after he was put in prison, there were some things that were revealed from the other side. In 1994, the judge pleaded guilty to embezzling $173,000 from one of his legal partners. He received probation at the time, but then in 1996, he was found guilty again of evading taxes, and he was sentenced to 2 months in prison. He died in 2002. Also in 1996, the prosecutor, Nicholas Bissell Jr., was convicted for taking nearly $200,000 from a co-owned gas station. While awaiting his sentencing, he was out on bail. He was facing 10 years in prison, and he decided to flee. Sadly, he was later found in a hotel room in Vegas when the authorities were coming through the door. He took his own life. Matt's brother Josh became a missionary, and he has never spoken publicly about his parents' deaths. I would like to introduce you to Latrice Matrell Curtis. Her friends and loved ones called her Trees. She was born on May 28, 1986, to parents Sherman Jones and Cynthia Wheeler of Raleigh, North Carolina. Latrice had 3 brothers, Justin, Marlon, and Jason, and 1 sister, Shanisha. Latrice was a daddy's girl. She grew up with her 3 older brothers, and she definitely got away with a lot more than they did growing up. They used to refer to her as Daddy's little boy in a dress, because Sherman did everything with his little baby girl, Latrice, things that you would traditionally do with a son. But it didn't matter because she loved spending time with her daddy. They would go fishing together, hunting, and most of all, Sherman taught little Latrice everything he knew about his favorite sport, which was basketball. They loved spending quality time together. Basketball equaled quality time. Sherman was dedicated to teaching Latrice how to dribble, how to shoot, and even how to do layups. When they weren't passing the ball on the court at the park, they were attached at the hip, doing everything and nothing at all. Sherman would joke around about her being like his little shadow, because, wherever he went, she seemed to follow right behind him, even to the point where he would end up stepping on her because she was right under his feet. He loved it and tried to enjoy it because he knew once his little girl got into her teens, it would most likely be a different story. And he was right. Junior high rolled around and Latrice was growing up. She was becoming her own person. She had her own hobbies and her own social life now. Instead of being right by Sherman's side, he had to go looking for her because she was always into something. She had a very active social life. Latrice was beautiful. She was one of the most popular girls at her high school. She was funny and outgoing, and everyone loved her. She knew how to make you laugh and put a smile on your face, and she always had guys talking to her, asking her out on dates. But she was more interested in school and staying out of trouble than boys, because her daddy, Sherman, was a juvenile corrections officer, so he made sure his kids were staying out of trouble. As she was coming into her own, she enjoyed more girly things, getting her nails done and her hair done. And as Sherman had imagined, that meant Latrice was spending less time with him playing basketball and less time hanging out with him because she didn't want to get her hair and her nails messed up. So that was the end of those types of bonding moments. But they still remained very close. Their relationship evolved as many parent-child relationships do, and in this case, with Latrice's parents trying to find other ways to be a part of her life and supportive of her endeavors, one of which was excelling academically. Latrice always had an interest in doing well in school. Her dream was to get married and have a family of her own one day. She made plans to go to college and fulfill that dream. After she graduated from high school, she attended Bennett College from 2004 to 2005. When her daddy dropped her off that first day, he cried and she cried, because they knew this was going to be the first time that they would be apart. But he knew how much she wanted this, so it was hard to say goodbye, but he knew he had to let her go. And Latrice did really well at Bennett. She then transferred to Wake Technical Community College in Greensboro, North Carolina. As Latrice was growing up, she was known as a cute, petite, bubbly young lady with a little unique kind of high-pitched voice that friends could recognize right away without even seeing her face. She was dedicated to her studies. She would stay up late studying, working on an exam or a college project, and during the first semester of her freshman year, she ended up meeting someone special. Even though boys were not a priority, this one mattered. His name was Darren Lee Curtis. He was also from Raleigh and was a former National Guard soldier. He was also in college, but he was attending the prestigious North Carolina Central University, about 30 minutes away in Durham. He was an accounting student, and they just hit it off. They had so much in common, and everyone could tell they were in love. Sometimes it's hard to get into a serious relationship in college, but it worked for these two because they were both serious about their studies. They allowed each other that time to sit there with their nose in a book, and they understood their priorities. They were also both working part-time in Raleigh. Latrice worked in human resources at the Sears department store in Triangle Town Center Mall, and Darren was a part-time accountant with a firm, also in Raleigh, so he had a 30-minute commute from school to work every day. They both valued hard work and being loyal to the company they were working for. They had also chosen to go the business route in college because they envisioned it would enable them both to get a high-paying job. Neither one wanted to worry about the burden of not having the things they needed or wanted in life, especially because they wanted to be able to support a family one day without worrying too much about where the money was coming from. They didn't want that to stand in the way of their goals. Though she was focused on her future goals of making a good living, Latrice was not materialistic. She was humble and down to earth. She was the type of friend you could count on to give you really good advice when you needed it. Many of her friends would come to her when they were having problems, and she would give them honest and straightforward answers that just made sense. People who knew Darren said that he was kind, down to earth, and they seemed to make a perfect couple. After they had been dating for a while, Latrice finally introduced him to her family. Her father was very protective, so even though they had already been dating for a bit, she waited to introduce Darren to her family because she didn't know how her father was going to take it or what he was going to think. One thing they could tell right away was how much Latrice liked Darren, so of course they were going to give him a shot. He was quiet, reserved, ambitious, and studious. He seemed like a good kid. All they hoped was that he was good for their daughter. Well, just 1 year into their relationship, Darren and Latrice knew that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. But first, they wanted to spend their days and nights together instead of living apart, so they moved in together to a luxury apartment complex in Raleigh called Aberley Grove. It was nice. It had a little barbecue area with a pool, a cute little dog park, and even a park for children, which would be great when the time came for them to start a family. This would be a perfect starter home for them. The rooms were nice and spacious, and they had a really cozy feel to them, even though it was an apartment. There was more exciting news. Latrice was accepted to North Carolina Central University, and now both of them would be making the 30-minute commute from Raleigh. But it was such a great school, so it was worth it. Latrice was majoring in business management and administration. The couple couldn't wait. They were determined to share the same last name ASAP. So on April 27, 2007, 1 month before Latrice's 21st birthday, they got married at the courthouse in Wake County. This wasn't exactly the type of wedding that her family had in mind for her. They actually didn't even know the couple was planning a wedding, and it turns out no one did. Not even Latrice's closest friends. Her work friends, for instance, like her colleague Kimberly Parker Dasher, who had been working with her for the last couple of years. At this point, they had become really good friends. As a matter of fact, Latrice surprised everyone by walking into work one day with a smile from ear to ear, but she was also wearing something else, a wedding ring. And yes, everyone noticed because Latrice was definitely making it obvious. You know how women can be, that's how she was. She was ecstatic, she was so happy, and they said, "Oh my God, is that a ring on your finger?" And she's like, "Yes, I got married." And they were like, "What?" Because everyone was shocked. They did not see that coming. Latrice just seemed very responsible, and not that it was irresponsible to get married out of the blue, they just weren't expecting it. Well, there was one person that wasn't as excited about the matrimony, and that was Sherman, Latrice's dad. He was pretty upset that Darren hadn't even asked him for his daughter's hand in marriage or even gotten to know the family. Sherman had no clue that this man was going to make Latrice his bride, and he felt disrespected. He was mad at Latrice as well, and he let it show. It was the type of emotion where he knew she was an adult, but he made it known that he wasn't thrilled about her choices. He had a hard time even talking to his daughter. He just held resentment, so even when she would call to check in and see how everyone was doing, he would give her the cold shoulder. He would give her a hard time, saying something like, "What's wrong with you, girl? What's the rush?" He knew that Latrice had purposely kept their intentions from him because she knew how he might react, as protective as he was. But at the end of the day, he knew it was Latrice's choice, and she chose Darren. By the early part of January 2008, Latrice was going into her senior year at NCCU. She was still working part-time at Sears in Raleigh, and she'd been married to Darren for about 9 months. However, she began taking her business classes at night instead of during the day. She wanted to use the daytime to work because the couple was coming up on their last years at the university, and she had even bigger plans ahead. She wanted to start a family. No surprise, we already know that's one of her goals, and she shared this goal with her friends. Before the holidays, she confided in one friend in particular, Anisha Baldwin. Anisha had worked with her for at least 3 years at Sears, and Latrice actually said she wanted to try for a baby right after Christmas, but Darren wasn't ready. Darren was 26 and Latrice was 21. So was Latrice ready? There could have been some added pressure, considering that one of her closest friends was pregnant and due right after the holidays. Latrice had time, and right now she was focused on school and work. Speaking of which, after a long day of work and classes, she would usually arrive home around 8 o'clock in the evening. After class got out, she would make that 30-minute commute, and Darren would usually get home 15 to 30 minutes after her, so their schedules worked out perfectly. They had stuck to this routine for some time now. Nothing was different on the evening of January 29th. Latrice had class, and Darren was at work. What wasn't ordinary was the next morning, January 30th, 2008. It wasn't ordinary at all, especially not for David Jones, who was on his morning commute on his way to a meeting. It was approximately 7:30. On a cold winter morning in Raleigh, David was driving down Interstate 540, and as traffic was slowing down, David passed time by looking out the window. He looked to the right, and something caught his eye, so he did a double take. He thought, "What is that?" The side of the road at this time of year wasn't green and full of life. It was brown from the snow melting. There was dry, golden brown brush lining both sides of the road. He saw something lying up an embankment, and it didn't blend into the foliage. It stood out. David couldn't just leave. He pulled off the shoulder a little bit so that he could take a closer look without his car moving along the road. He thought he knew what he was looking at, so he called 911. He said he was going westbound on I-540, just past the Buffalo Road exit, and he thought he saw a body on the side of the road. To picture what David was looking at, I want to describe what this highway is like and what the terrain looks like on both sides. This will help you envision what David was seeing. By this time, it was light outside. He was going westbound, just past that Buffalo exit. The ground next to the highway was a golden brown color, short, dry, dead grass. There wasn't tall green grass or bushes. It was less dense, so anything on the ground would stand out. What David saw was something lying on the embankment, like I said, so it was on a bit of an incline, up toward more of a wooded area. After that call, he was 100% certain that he knew what he was looking at. There was no mistaking it for anything else. He won't ever forget that moment, and I don't think you will either when you find out exactly what he was looking at. The 911 dispatcher sent officers to the location, and sure enough, it didn't take more than a few glances for officers to know that they were dealing with a deceased human being. As they approached, they could ascertain that it was a black female in her 20s. She was on her back with both arms spread out above her head, and her legs were spread very far apart, probably as far as they could go. She was wearing blue jeans, a white long-sleeve top covered in blood. There was no mistaking what David saw. With the way the body was positioned, it would have almost been facing the road on a slant instead of being flat. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine how shocking it would be? I was able to find pictures of this crime scene, and I'm doing my very best to describe this because it has stuck with me. Can you imagine you're driving by, and when you look over, instead of something being completely flat on the ground, you're seeing a person with their arms outstretched, and they're on an incline? So instead of being back, they're up a little bit, so it's almost as though they're just facing the road like that. And the stark contrast of her dark skin and the white shirt, the bright white shirt, and the blood on the blue jeans and the white shirt, it was haunting. Initially, the first responders that got there thought this was probably a pedestrian that was struck by a vehicle, because it's common when people are walking on the side of the road. A driver's eyes can catch a glimpse of them and be drawn like the steering wheel can swerve and be drawn in that direction. It's an auto response. It's very dangerous to be on the shoulder of a busy highway, and it's absolutely terrible when this happens. But when they get closer, they realize that is not what happened here. This is not an accident at all. Someone did this to this poor girl. Officers get to work quickly to secure the scene. They don't want a passerby glancing over and seeing this horrific scene in front of them. They put up a tent around the body. They had a blue tarp over her, And then they put out something you can't miss at a crime scene: the yellow tape around the perimeter of the scene. Homicide detectives are called out, along with Jennifer Raymer, who was the assistant district attorney of Wake County at the time. And as Jennifer walked up, she could tell this was brutal. It was as though all the blood had been drained because she was so pale, powdery blue in color. It was clear that a stabbing had occurred. And I shouldn't even refer to it as a stabbing, because this was repeated impacts again and again, open wounds, large ones specifically on the face, the neck, the chest. Jennifer knew this was more than someone that just wanted this woman to die. It was as though they were sending a message, and it was a personal one. So the first thing they want to do is identify who the body belongs to. But she doesn't have anything on her, and there's no vehicle in sight. So, who was their Jane Doe on the side of I-540? Investigators don't have much to go on. This is a very busy section of the highway. Cars are rushing by, hundreds of cars every hour. They don't know how long she's been lying there, but they estimate from the condition of her body that it has been hours. At this point, they're thinking, can we even find any eyewitnesses that would have seen anything as they're passing by at a high rate of speed, in addition to peering out through a blanket of darkness at night? There is a slim chance. So they rely on clues that may be nearby at the scene. Some investigators begin walking on foot down the highway in both directions, while others get into their vehicles to canvass the entire area. They do end up locating Latrice's phone. It was found several hundred feet from her body, turned off and exposed to rain and other environmental elements. But not even half a mile from where the woman's body was found, investigators see two cars parked on the side of the road, a white Honda Civic and a white Nissan Sentra. And there's a man standing by the Nissan, peering inside with the door wide open. What's going on here? And are these cars connected to their Jane Doe? Wait until you find out who this man is. It was a shock to detectives, that's for sure, because they're questioning him right away, asking, "Better identify yourself." And he explains that he's the husband of Latrice Curtis. And guess what? He reported her missing just about an hour earlier. He says he just found her car, the white Nissan, on the side of the road, so he stopped to see what was going on. It's plain to see the Nissan has been involved in a crime, a bloody one. It doesn't even take a search of it to see evidence that there has been a struggle. It's apparent just by looking at the driver's seat. There's blood all over it. And Darren is standing right next to it. So clearly, investigators need to get Darren away from the vehicle and run the license plate number to match the car to its registered owner. And sure enough, the search comes back to Latrice Curtis. They pull up the ID and they see her picture, and they were able to do a preliminary match to the woman's body they found. And that's really sad. Now they have a name to match to their victim, and it's time to gather Latrice, transport her to the coroner's office so that they can do a full autopsy and a 100% DNA confirmation of her identity. And you probably already made this connection, considering we are here today, and we wouldn't be if something bad hadn't happened to poor Latrice. But I have to backtrack so that you can get all the facts as they're playing out that fateful morning. Investigators bring Darren to the station, and they're asking him, "How did you end up at Latrice's car just minutes before detectives arrived, and less than an hour after you reported her missing?" So he begins his version of the story. Darren explains he gets a call from Latrice around 10 p.m. the night before. It's a normal call. Nothing seemed like it was out of the ordinary. She said that she was running late from class. She'd been in the library studying and whatnot, and now she's on her way home, but she may stop and get a bite to eat first. She tells him to expect her home around 11:30 p.m. The thing is, Latrice never makes it home. And you'd think that her husband would find that a little bit odd, right? Because investigators are kind of puzzled when they ask him about that. Darren said he was so tired that he just fell asleep. I mean, I personally couldn't sleep if my loved one wasn't home, but that's me. And I get it, everybody's different, and this was an ordinary night according to Darren, nothing to think twice about. However, this was not an ordinary night. Not at all. They want to know, when did you realize your wife hadn't come home the night before? Darren explained he woke up at his usual time, around 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and they're like, "Wait a minute, you went to sleep? You never woke up once? You never checked if your wife came home?" And he's like, "I was asleep, but when I woke up, yes, I realized Latrice is not in bed with me." So he says that he calls her to make sure that everything's okay, and it goes straight to her voicemail. So he leaves a message telling her, "Hey, I'm just calling to make sure you're all right, and just give me a call back whenever you can." Darren assumes that Latrice may have gone to her parents' house and slept over there. She may still be asleep. So, he tells investigators he proceeded to get ready for work, showering, eating, his whole morning routine. Then he leaves their apartment to head to work around 7:30 in the morning. But here's where things get weird. Darren says he takes I-540 to work every single morning, and as he's driving, he glances over and thinks he spots a car on the side of the road that looks like the one his wife drives, the white Nissan. But he's on the highway, he's driving by, it's just a split-second glance. However, a little further down, the traffic starts to get into a standstill. Now he's passing slowly, and he spots yellow crime scene tape. And of course that catches his eye. That's not something he's used to seeing on his morning commute. Even worse, as his eyes adjust, he sees the blue tarp, and that's when he says he gets a knot in his stomach. According to him, he decides to turn off the highway and go back home to check on his wife. It was the fact that she didn't make it home, coupled with the sight of the tarp, it just hit him. He couldn't help but think, what if something happened to my wife? Where is she? So, he goes all the way back to their apartment. Her car isn't there, and when he goes inside, she's nowhere to be found. So, he's feeling even worse at this point. But investigators can't help but be a little bit skeptical of all this. But of course, they keep listening and asking him what happened next. He tells them he begins calling up Latrice's mom, dad, and other family members. No one has seen her, no one's heard from her since the night before. She did not spend the night at her parents' house. So, according to Darren, he gets a really bad feeling, and he reports her missing to the police. Okay, so they still want to understand how he ends up at her car, basically at the same time that the detectives are out there. He explains that, as he's on the phone with the police, he's also retracing his wife's path. He remembers the white car and wants to check on that white car he saw on the side of the road on Interstate 540. So he gets back on the highway to find it, and sure enough, when he pulls off to check, he's able to identify that it's hers within seconds. And that's when he tells detectives he got out of his car, went to the driver's side, and opened the door. Perfect. His fingerprints are now on it. I mean, not that they wouldn't have been, they probably both drove the car at some point, they lived together. But just wait. As soon as he opens the door, he looks inside and notices there's a broken console, there's blood on the door. He also spots a picture of Latrice from Christmas, crumpled up and lying on the back seat. Then, that's when the law enforcement officers arrived at Latrice's car, meeting up with Darren after they had just come from the nearby homicide scene. I don't know about you, but it sounded a little too coincidental. And that's what detectives were thinking as well. Darren somehow arrives at his wife's car, his deceased wife's car, his murdered wife's car, before the detectives. The car is also considered a crime scene, so he's at the scene of a crime. With a story like this one, that would be pretty convenient if he were the one who did this, wouldn't it? Oh no, it wasn't me. I just got here. Like, I'm just checking up on my wife. Why didn't you do that last night? They followed normal procedure. They asked Darren to allow them to examine his clothing as well as his body, his arms, hands, etc., to see if there's a sign that any kind of altercation happened. And there are no marks on him. His clothes are clean. They take photos of him, and he's completely willing to allow them to take a DNA sample. But they are pressing him even harder. After that, they want to put pressure on him. They want to know, what was your relationship like with your wife? And by the way, that morning, while all of this is going on, Latrice's father, Sherman, is also about to find out what happened to his daughter. His morning started out differently than Darren's. The first thing that Sherman does when he wakes up is turn on the news to see what's going on. And that day, the first thing he sees is a breaking news report. He sees that scene, the stretch of highway right near Wake Tech Community College. He sees the exit sign, the yellow crime scene tape, and the technicians kneeling next to a blue tarp. There's text on the screen that reads, "Body found on I-540." But this doesn't faze Sherman, because these things happen. There was no reason he would have ever expected this to be his own daughter underneath that tarp, but sadly it was. Sherman gets a call from Darren asking if he knew where Latrice was, and Sherman's thinking, she's your wife. You are her husband. You live with her. Shouldn't you be the one that knows where your wife is? Darren's like, no, and he told him about the night before. Sherman is stunned. He cannot fathom going to sleep and not even thinking about waking up to make sure that your wife made it home safely. He thinks it's really odd and it makes him angry. So, Sherman calls the university and he gets transferred to a security guard who tells him, "You should probably get in touch with the sheriff's department." Sherman is confused. He's like, what for? Why the sheriff's office? The first thing that usually comes to mind is that your child has gotten themselves into trouble. And remember, Sherman was a former juvenile detention officer, so it's in his instinct to assume Latrice had done something wrong. When he calls the sheriff says, "You need to come down to the station." So Sherman and his wife jump in the car, and they are speechless the entire drive. They didn't say one single word to each other, and they arrived there around 11 o'clock in the morning. Someone from the station greets them and puts them into a room. Finally, after quite some time, an officer comes in and tells them the horrible news about their daughter. They said the body that was found on the side of I-540 was identified that morning as their daughter, Latrice Curtis. Worse yet, her parents find out that Darren had already been there to visually identify their daughter, and he didn't say one single word. They didn't hear one single word from that man. Nothing. Sherman is pissed, and rightfully so. The police wouldn't even let Latrice's parents see her body because they were not listed as her next of kin. Her husband was. It's devastating. Sherman thinks that Darren just nonchalantly went to sleep, not caring about Latrice at all. And that was his biggest fear, that this man wasn't the right one, that he wasn't going to be there to protect his daughter. They didn't get to see Darren that day, but Sherman wanted to see him for sure. And I think you might know why, because he wanted to give him more than just a piece of his mind. Darren never got in touch with Latrice's family, and just wait, you'll understand more later. But it didn't matter. They wanted nothing to do with Darren, because Sherman's mind was set. That man didn't protect his daughter. That man hurt her. He's about to go off at the police station. He's like, let me get my hands on that man. And it makes sense that a lot of emotions would be running high. He just found out his daughter has been murdered. However, even though investigators don't have a solid alibi for Darren, considering he says he was asleep the night before, and the only person who would have been able to confirm that is dead, they also don't have anything to hold him on. They can't arrest him. So, they have to let him go. He complied with their wishes. He consented to a search of the apartment, gave his DNA and fingerprints, and they sent him on his way. But he had to have known that he was a suspect. I mean, come on, it's obvious that the person closest to the victim is going to be the most likely suspect. Nevertheless, investigators have to gather more evidence, no matter what. At this point, the crime scene had become a media frenzy. A beautiful young college student found dead on the side of the highway. It made for a very good headline for newspapers and TV. But sometimes, that is a necessary evil to get people's eyes on a case, to get the attention it needs in order to be solved. The search of the apartment that Latrice shared with Darren didn't show any signs of a struggle. They also conducted a search of Darren's white Honda Civic, and there was no physical evidence that a crime had been committed or that a struggle had ensued. At this point, there's nothing linking Darren to the crime scene or the murder of his wife. He said that they were happy, they were in love, and they didn't have any marital issues whatsoever. Well, there's about to be a discovery during Latrice's autopsy that may change that perception. For now, Darren is left to grieve the death of his wife, and investigators move on to the next lead while they're in the apartment complex. Investigators go door to door to interview neighbors. They want to get an outside perspective on the newlyweds. One neighbor, 29-year-old Tiona Washington, said that the couple was quiet and she mostly kept to herself. However, they had talked on several occasions, just casual hellos, you know how neighbors do, like, "How are you? What's new?" That kind of thing. Tiona said she's a counselor at Wilson Community College, and she had never seen Darren at the apartment complex, ever. Even on her way, coming and going to and from work, she never saw him once. But another neighbor, Tanya Shields, said she saw Darren almost every day. Both neighbors say that Latrice usually arrived home around 8 p.m. However, Tanya was in the parking lot the night before, working on her car until about 9 p.m., and Latrice never pulled in. Darren, however, did return. It was about 8:15 or 8:30 p.m., and Tanya said he was carrying a leather briefcase and a shoulder bag that was the size of a laptop. Neither one of the immediate neighbors said that they had ever heard the couple arguing, but it didn't appear that they were that happy either. It didn't seem like they were in love or anything like that, because Tanya said she never saw them smiling. This is interesting information from the people who see them on a regular basis, but to be fair, these neighbors were not friends with the couple. It's still valuable information, especially the part about Tanya seeing Darren come home that night. Still, this doesn't move the investigation forward, so they start to interview people close to Latrice, one of whom is her friend Kimberly. She considers herself Latrice's best friend. She had just found out that Latrice was dead. Her mother told her, and it was shocking. Kimberly had already heard about the body that they found on the side of the highway, but it being Latrice, somebody she knew, it never crossed her mind. But when she got home from work, her mother rushed over and said, "Kimberly, that body that they found, it was Latrice." She can't believe it. She kind of fought it, saying, "No, it's not, it can't be." And her mom kept saying, "Yes, it is." She really just broke down, saying, "I don't think it's her because she just called me last night." That's right. Latrice made another phone call that night, and it was after the one to Darren. So what was it about? Well, Kimberly goes down to the police station to give investigators the information that she has about Latrice. Isn't it interesting that both people who were closest to Latrice got a phone call around 2 a.m.? Isn't that kind of weird? Think about it for a second. Who do you think used her phone to make those calls? Because Latrice was most likely deceased at that time. Kimberly tells them that something very eerie occurred the night before, and she thinks it may be connected to the murder. She says that she was asleep and heard her phone ringing in the middle of the night. It could have been somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning or so, and it woke her up. She was surprised to see the number that was calling because it was Latrice, and Latrice never calls that late. So she was worried and quickly answered it, saying, "Hello, Latrice," but nobody said anything. As quiet as her room was that night, Kimberly could hear noises on the other end. She could hear wind and a distinct sound of cars rushing by on a road. It sounded like she was near the highway or something, and she could hear what sounded like footsteps on gravel, but no one was saying anything. It was odd. She was confused. She just sat there and listened for a bit and got this gut feeling inside that she shouldn't hang up. At this point, she's calling out to Latrice, just repeating her name over and over again, almost yelling into the phone, "Latrice! Latrice!" just over and over again, and no response. So finally, she hung up, but she doesn't feel right. It scared her, it felt wrong, and she tried to call back, but this time the call went straight to voicemail. Kimberly wanted so badly to call Darren, but she didn't know his number. Now that she knows what happened to Latrice, Kimberly wished that she would have stayed on the phone and listened. That could have been the killer's footsteps that she was hearing, and so many things were going on in her mind. She said that she was trying to piece together what the call was about. Was it before the murder? Was it during? Was it after? When and what were the noises? It was just haunting to think that she could have been listening at the moment her friend was killed, and there was nothing that she could do. I told you that the media was getting on this case very quickly. They knew it was going to be something big. So they go ahead and release Darren's 911 call, and the rumors start to fly. In cases like this, it is usually the husband. And there were many people that think it's very unusual that Darren would make that 911 call to report Latrice missing around the same exact time the body was found. Was this some kind of way to create an alibi? He sounds pretty calm, in my opinion, for someone who thinks his wife is actually missing, and the public thinks so too. Darren definitely felt the pressure. You go from being a nobody at all, nobody knows you, nobody knows what you look like, knows your name, to everyone recognizing you, pointing fingers, bombarding you at your apartment, and not for something good. That was what was happening to him within just a day of this crime occurring. Because everyone wants answers, surprisingly, Darren calls the investigation with something that he says he dug up after being released from the police station the day before. He says as soon as he got home, he started doing some research of his own. He pulled up Latrice's phone records, specifically looking for a few things. A number of a friend who is expecting a baby, because he wanted to gather some more information from anyone that he knew his wife was talking to on a regular basis. He also wanted to know who Latrice was calling the night before. He tells investigators that he stumbled upon a phone number that Latrice had called a couple of times. It was a number that he figured out she called and texted a lot. The number wasn't familiar to him, so he tells investigators that he called it. He was surprised when a man picked up. Darren was like, "Who is this? How do you know Latrice?" The man said, "She didn't come home last night." Instead of explaining himself, the guy on the other end just asked, "Is she okay? Let me know if she's okay." And he said this several times, according to Darren, who says he was too shocked and confused to say anything more. So clearly there was another man in Latrice's life. But who was he? Investigators aren't sure how accurate the story is. Darren could be trying to take the focus off himself, but they take down the information and get a copy of Latrice's phone records so they can analyze them. This man could be anyone. He could be a coworker, a friend. It doesn't have to be sinister, but the way he asked if Latrice was okay does raise a red flag if it's true, because why was he so concerned? So they run this unknown male's phone number. It comes back to a Stephen Randolph. To them, he means nothing at this point, but it's another lead, and that is important. This Stephen guy could provide them with more information about their victim, so they set out to track him down. Meanwhile, the autopsy report comes back. It's bad, horrific actually, just the sheer, brutal manner in which Latrice was injured. The report revealed that she sustained blunt force trauma to her head, specifically behind her right ear. But what was completely unbelievable and devastating was that they discovered upward of 40 wounds on her face, her neck, her chest. Her torso had been stabbed. It was extreme. The wounds went through her carotid artery, her jugular vein. Even her vocal cords were cut. One wound started on one side of her neck and went across to the other side in an attempt to completely remove her head. There was also a struggle between Latrice and the perpetrator because her fingernails were damaged. This wasn't a robbery. She still had her personal belongings and a pair of expensive earrings that were still in her ears. It's estimated that she was killed between the hours of 1 and 2 a.m. Also, the fact that her car was far away from her body meant to detectives that someone else drove her car. So they decide to take swabs from the inside of the steering wheel, the console, and other areas, and test them for DNA evidence, along with her body and anything on her fingernails and whatnot. When investigators find all of this out, though, it's really hard for them to look past Darren being the one that did this. But the fact that he's just introduced another man into the situation leads them to believe that he might be tipping his hat, that he might, like I said, be trying to force them in another direction. Did Darren find out what was going on with Latrice and another guy? They're about to get answers due to something else that the medical examiner found during the autopsy: a condom. They find a condom stuck inside of Latrice's body. So it's up inside there, it's stuck inside. And that's interesting. This is unusual. This is something they need to question Darren about, and he comes back and says, "I don't use condoms with my wife." So things are getting very complicated and confusing. If this wasn't a condom from Darren and Latrice having sex, who was it from, and why was it still there? This is all happening at the same time that they find out who Stephen Randolph is. It turns out he's pretty popular, he's a good-looking basketball player, and North Carolina Central University was actually trying to become a professional NBA basketball player. He took his college basketball career very seriously. They don't exactly know what the connection would be between Latrice and Stephen, though. However, when they go back and interview some of Latrice's friends, a few of them say they do know about Stephen and that he and Latrice were close. In the last few months, they had grown even closer. But what does that mean exactly? Why doesn't Darren seem to know about Stephen or who he is? Was this Stephen's condom that they found during the autopsy? Investigators don't have to wonder very much longer because just 2 days after Latrice's body was discovered, Stephen walks into the Wake County Sheriff's Office and he wants to speak to detectives. He's not alone. He is with a local pastor named Robert Reeves. This looks interesting. You've got your pastor escorting you to the police station. There's got to be something going on here. Sometimes people don't answer to God first and confess their sins straight to the Lord. Sometimes they go to their pastor first. So, investigators are very interested in what is going on here. They take Stephen into one room and Pastor Reeves into another. Investigators don't waste a second of their time. They immediately ask Stephen, "Who are you, and what business do you have with our victim, Latrice Curtis, a married woman?" He says, "Well, I attend North Carolina Central with Latrice. I play basketball. We had a few classes together. We met back in September. We're just friends. We see each other here and there. And we're friends, emphasis on friends 4 times. So detectives are like, "Okay, let me get this straight. You're just friends? For the record, you're friends with Latrice Curtis, right? Nothing more? You just see each other during classes? You don't ever see each other anywhere else?" And that's when he said, "Well, we do sometimes study together at the library." Now he's lying, and they know that, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. These detectives are not stupid, they're seasoned detectives. They have dealt with men like Stephen before, and they have an inkling that that condom they found is his. That's when they take those phone records and push them right in front of him. They say, "Stephen, we know you're not being honest with us. She talked to you the night she was killed. As a matter of fact, you might be one of the last people to talk to Latrice." There's a phone call between Stephen and Latrice after 10 p.m. following the phone call to her husband. Not only that, detectives show that a phone call came into his phone from Latrice around 2 o'clock in the morning. So what does he have to say about all that? Were those just friendly phone calls right before Latrice was killed? That is when he starts to come up with a different version of his and Latrice's relationship, one that is more than just friends, which is what detectives already assumed was the truth. Now he says, "Okay, you know what? We're more than friends, but it just started happening. We were friends. This was the first time that we were intimate. She came over to my house, and things progressed into sex." That's when they confront him about what they found during the autopsy, the condom. He doesn't hesitate on that one, because they're probably going to somehow find DNA or something on the condom. So, there's no backing down at this point. He admits it. "Yes, that was my condom." So was there a reason why Miss Curtis still had a condom inside of her? That's what they want to know. Why was it there? This is when Stephen explains that while they were having sex, somehow the condom fell off. After they were done, they noticed it was missing. They couldn't find it anywhere. So, naturally, they assumed it was inside Latrice. Stephen explained he tried to retrieve the condom, and Latrice tried to retrieve it too, but neither one of them could get it out. Yes, the condom was trapped inside, and they didn't know what to do. They were both concerned, clearly. You usually use a condom because you don't want to get pregnant or get an STD, both or either one of those things, so it's a concern. Latrice having an affair clearly wouldn't want to have a condom stuck inside for various reasons. Number 1, what if her husband finds it? Number 2, what if she gets pregnant with another man's child? And number 3, does this man have an STD, and now she might because the condom failed. Lots of questions are going through her mind, potentially. And as for Steven, he will be concerned because he's a basketball player. It's a pretty big deal in his world. He's an athlete with a lot of ambition. He's a big man on campus, a standout student at his school, and he's having a relationship with a married woman. I'm pretty sure that he did not want to get Latrice pregnant. That would probably throw off a lot of his plans. Investigators are really starting to put things together here, especially when they ask, what happens next? Steven says, well, Latrice was getting uncomfortable because she was trying to retrieve the condom, and she couldn't. So she says, I've got to leave. I've got to do this in the privacy of my own bathroom, or just somewhere else. She didn't feel comfortable, and she could probably have better luck if she was able to be alone to figure it out. While investigators are thinking this could have been why Steven got upset, because she was adamant about leaving, his reputation could have been in a position to be compromised, especially because it turns out Steven also has a girlfriend. He is not single, and he was expected over at her house that night. This is where he said he went after leaving his apartment. When Latrice told him that she had to go, he made his way to his girlfriend's house. They asked him approximately what time Latrice left and what time he went over to his girlfriend's. They're trying to put together a timeline. They know Latrice talked to Darren around 10 p.m. that night. Remember, she said she was running late from class. She was at the library studying. Darren said nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She told him she was on her way home and she might stop to get a bite to eat. So that would mean she would arrive around 11:30 p.m. The thing is, we know Latrice was lying. She wasn't running late from class and she wasn't studying at the library. She was actually at Steven's, having sex with him. Steven said she left his house somewhere around 10 p.m. and that he left shortly afterward. Then he says, you can confirm this with my friend Warren Robertson because I called him to tell him what was happening. Warren met him at his girlfriend's house, Velma Newton, that's her name, sometime after 10 p.m., and he was with him for the next few hours until he and Steven went home around 1:30 in the morning. However, detectives know that there were 2 calls made after 1:30 in the morning from Latrice's phone, one to Kimberly and one to Steven. So which one came first, and why were those calls made? Steven is adamant that he had nothing to do with Latrice's murder. However, investigators are not so sure of that because he is now at the top of their list of suspects. When they talk to his friend Warren, it doesn't help that Warren was called into Texas to want to know what's going on with Steven. What happened the night before? Warren lets them know it's true. Steven called, and he was frantic. He was talking about what happened with the condom. He was saying, I'm worried about this entire situation, and he needed someone to talk to. He told him that a few friends were going to meet up at Velma's, and he told Warren to come. As soon as Warren gets there, he says that Steven's phone is blowing up with calls from Latrice. Steven is trying to figure out what he should do. Finally, he answers Latrice's phone call. Warren is sitting right there. He can hear everything that's going on. He knows the content of that conversation, and it was about Latrice being scared she might be pregnant. This was a stressful conversation, and not only that, Warren says that Latrice was interested in taking the relationship to the next level. That's another thing that was discussed in this phone call, her intention to leave her husband. Well, that's a shock, because as far as Darren was concerned, he told detectives that nothing was wrong in their marriage. Maybe the neighbors were right. Maybe they didn't look happy because they weren't happy. They press Warren for more information, and he says, well, Steven started talking to Latrice because she said that she and her husband were separated. The phone call, very stressful in nature, was compounded by the fact that Latrice was worried about now going home to her husband with the condom stuck inside. He also states that Steven was correct in saying that they both left Velma's place around 1:30. Now detectives are looking back in Darren's direction. Maybe everything he told police was a lie after all. He was the one they found at the crime scene. They're about to get more information that tends to complicate things even more, because remember that they're interviewing the pastor in the other room. I mean, how could they get any luck here? They have a man of God who has come forward about to tell them information regarding one of the biggest sins against another human being: murder. Pastor Robert Reeves is a 43-year-old evangelical minister. He's actually affectionately known by the community as the Bishop, and this is a very tight-knit evangelical community. He's well known in this community. Pastor Reeves is a very well-respected man. He's a motivational speaker, he's a mentor, and he's very charismatic. So it's no wonder why someone like Stephen would come to him for advice, especially in the current situation he was going through. So, detectives are eager to talk to Pastor Reeves, and the pastor is eager to talk to them. Detectives ask Pastor Reeves what he can tell them about Stephen, and he explains he met Stephen at a car wash while Stephen was working there in the summer of 2007. Whenever the pastor was over there getting his car washed, they would have small talk together. What he gathered from Stephen in those conversations was that Stephen was very serious about his basketball career, but he had fallen on some hard times. He didn't have a steady job, and he wasn't getting paid enough. He didn't have a place to live, and he was basically crashing on friends' couches. So the pastor did what he does with everyone. He ministers to them. He tells him, "Listen, here's my information, talk to me, come to my church, maybe there's something that we can do to figure out your situation." Eventually the pastor offers him his basement. He says, "Listen, I live with my sister, Willie Mae Thorpe, but I have a 2-bedroom house. My sister lives in the other room upstairs, but I have a basement suite, and I wouldn't mind renting it to you for like $300 a month. Can you do that until you get back on your feet?" Stephen says, "Yeah, that would really help him out." So he explains to the detectives that Stephen's been living there ever since. The pastor tries to help him whenever he can, but they want to know more about Stephen himself. The pastor describes him as a ladies' man, and yes, he's aware that Stephen is bringing women back to the house. No, he's not thrilled about it, but he's free to do what he wants. The detectives specifically want to know about the night of the 29th, and Pastor Reeves explains that he did know about a woman that Stephen brought home that night. He confirms Latrice had been there. He said he saw Latrice's white car in the driveway when he was on his way to church service around 8 p.m. And he was at church until about 11 or 11:30, and when he came home, both Stephen's and Latrice's cars were no longer there. He was at home for the rest of the night, and he did not notice anything unusual. But the next morning something happened. Stephen confided in him about a phone call between him and Latrice sometime around midnight. Detectives want to know more because they know there was a phone call that was made in the middle of the night, and maybe when Stephen was relaying it to the pastor he said midnight, but it was really like 2 a.m. According to Pastor Reeves, Stephen said the phone call was in regard to Latrice wanting to take the relationship to the next level. From Pastor Reeves' perspective, it seemed like Stephen was implying he wasn't interested in having a deeper relationship with Latrice, that it was just a sexual encounter. Besides, this is a man who already has a girlfriend, and Latrice is married, so this kind of piques the investigators' interest because they didn't hear that version from Stephen himself. This is the second time they're hearing about a relationship being taken to another level. The tone in Pastor Reeves' voice is one of disappointment mixed with accusation. It really seems like the evidence is pointing to Stephen. They were curious as to whether Stephen thought that somehow Latrice was going to get in the way of his career, because if this was an unexpected pregnancy and he's about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract, or he believes that he is because he's thinking he's going to go into the NBA, he could have done something drastic, and now he's trying to cover his tracks. Not only that, Pastor Reeves mentioned, by the way, that Stephen has a knife and sword collection. So they executed a search warrant for Stephen's car and the home that he shares with the pastor. They also want to make sure to interview Willie Mae, Pastor Reeves' sister, as well as Velma Newton, who was Stephen's girlfriend. I know there were a lot of players in the story, and I'm doing my very best to keep track of each and every one the best that I can. The search of Stephen's car, as well as the room he was renting in the basement of Pastor Reeves' house, doesn't turn up any clues. There are no connections to the murder. Nothing in the house shows any sign of a struggle or anything that even connects Stephen to Latrice. However, when detectives are at Pastor Reeves' residence, they're doing a very thorough investigation, and they run the license plate of a minivan that's sitting in the driveway. This minivan belongs to Pastor Reeves. However, there's a hit on the license plate, being involved in some kind of traffic incident on January 30th around 1:30 in the morning. That was just 6 hours before Latrice's body was discovered. It turns out a state trooper named Isaac Cooper from the North Carolina Highway Patrol is driving around checking for disabled vehicles. That was part of his routine that night. He's going along Interstate 540 and sees a minivan. It's on the shoulder on the eastbound side, and it has its hazard lights on. So he stops to make sure everything's okay, and when the officer gets to the vehicle, no one's inside. That was odd. The hazards are on, the windshield wipers are going, the windows are kind of open a bit, and the driver's side window is halfway down even though it's raining. So he checks the door, and it's unlocked. The keys are still in the ignition, but no one's there. He thought that was really weird. So he's looking around, and he notices on the opposite side of I-540, now this is westbound, there's a white car, and it has its hazards on as well. The trooper went ahead and ran the license plate of the minivan. That's why it's in the system. However, he never got a chance to get the license plate of the other car because he got called away. Once he was given an update about the minivan not being stolen, he kind of dismissed the incident altogether. Plus, that vehicle was no longer there. However, after getting the description of the vehicle on the other side of the highway, investigators realized that was most likely Latrice's vehicle. Not to mention, the location that the trooper gave them for the white vehicle wasn't where it was ultimately found. That location was actually where the body was found, so that car had been moved to its final destination after the trooper had seen it across the highway in close proximity to a minivan belonging to the roommate of their prime suspect, Stephen Randolph. Since they have Pastor Reeves still there, they ask him if he knows or has any explanation as to why his vehicle would be located on the side of the road at 1 o'clock in the morning the night of Latrice's murder. And he's like, wait a minute, no, I didn't put it there. But he has an explanation. The only other person that has a key to that vehicle is Stephen, and he uses it all the time. As a matter of fact, he was driving that vehicle the past couple of weeks because his car was in the shop being repaired. Now, I told you this case was going to be confusing, but detectives don't really think it is. They know that Stephen left Velma's around 1:30. According to Warren, whose vehicle was he driving or whose vehicle did he possibly pick up after returning back home? When I say home, we know it's Pastor Reeves's house. Did he possibly tell Latrice that he was going to meet her somewhere, and that was what the phone call was about at 2 a.m.? It makes sense, but they've got to prove it. They call Velma in for questioning, and she confirms her boyfriend is Stephen Randolph. She states he was at her house at 10 o'clock and left somewhere around 1:30. He's a really good guy. There's no way he would be involved in murdering someone, according to her. They ask her if she noticed anything unusual or suspicious about him, and she says no, he was perfectly fine. He was completely normal, nothing was out of the ordinary. Well, now they tell her about the fact that they knew he was having an affair with Latrice. Then they specifically ask her if Stephen ever drives Pastor Reeves' minivan, and she says, yeah, he's had to drive it several times. But she still insists, I'm telling you, he has nothing to do with this murder. And that's when they look at her and say, well, do you? That's surprising, but it kind of makes sense. These love triangles can make people do crazy things. Maybe Velma knew what was going on. Maybe she didn't want to lose her NBA-bound boyfriend. Maybe she was worried about a pregnancy and overheard conversations that her boyfriend was having at her apartment. The fact that he had slept with another woman that night, and she would possibly be able to find that out, could be a reason why someone would commit a crime like this. But she's like, listen, you don't understand. You don't know the reason why Stephen was driving Pastor Reeves' vehicle. It's because his tires had been slashed a couple of weeks ago. Not only that, someone was targeting him and Velma. Maybe that same person had a reason to hurt or target Latrice as well. Detectives want to understand what in the world this woman is talking about. There's so much information coming out, they don't know where to start. But now they've got this story about slashed tires and people targeting one another. Well, she can explain. She says that they had been receiving really weird phone calls. There was a person threatening her and trying to break up her and Stephen. They would call over and over again. This person wasn't just threatening Velma, they were also calling Stephen and doing the exact same thing. Velma explained that in late October 2007, just a few months earlier, she started to get really threatening phone calls. She ends up telling Stephen about them. This man that was calling said that he was going to end Stephen's basketball career and break his legs, that Velma needed to tell her boyfriend to stop doing whatever he was doing. Velma couldn't figure out who was making these phone calls because the person had blocked their number, but it turned out Stephen was also getting these calls. One time the caller said they hoped that Stephen had a gun. Detectives ask her, "Well, does Stephen have a gun?" And she says, he does. Yeah, he does. He had gotten it in the past year. She explained that the slashed tires happened pretty recently. It was on December 11th. Stephen had plans to come over to her house, but when he went to leave, he realized that his car had a flat tire. So he goes to the gas station and gets the tire fixed, ultimately making it to her place. While he's there, he starts getting these threatening phone calls again from a private number. When he goes to leave Velma's later that night, he walks out and all 4 of his tires had been slashed. Velma also remembers that when Stephen called Pastor Reeves to ask him for help, he told Stephen that someone had been ringing the doorbell at the house and running away. So, they're freaked out when Pastor Reeves offers to come get him from Velma. Stephen doesn't even want to go back home because he's scared. He just had his tires slashed, and he hears someone is ringing the front doorbell where he lives. So, he decides he's just gonna stay where he is and spend the night with Velma. The next morning, Stephen and Pastor Reeves get his car towed. Meanwhile, the pastor lets him borrow the minivan so that he can get to school until he can get enough money to actually repair his tires because it's expensive. He couldn't get them fixed right away. Velma said that both of them were really freaked out. Not to mention, Christmas break, Stephen goes home to visit his family in Baltimore, and when he's gone, Velma gets a phone call again. This time the caller tells Velma, "I just slashed your tires. I'm really sorry." She recorded this phone call, and she wasn't even home at the time where her car was, so she called someone that was and asked them to go outside and check on her car. It turns out all 4 of her tires were also slashed. Detectives don't know what to make of all this, but it sounds very ominous, it sounds scary, and it doesn't sound right, so they want to see the phone records, and they pull them up. Velma's right, there were calls coming in from a blocked number on the days that she talked about on both her phone and Stephen's phone. So who's making these calls? Well, they suspect it's most likely Darren, their first suspect. It's probably some kind of revenge because this is the man that is talking to his wife. This case was hard for investigators because the people they interviewed who are at the top of their list really don't have airtight alibis. Darren says he's at home sleeping, with no one to confirm that. Velma says that she's at home. She sees her boyfriend Stephen leave around 1:30. His friend also leaves at 1:30, and they all go to their homes with no one to confirm that they were really there. Nobody has anyone to 100% confirm they weren't out committing this crime. So maybe there's someone who can clear it up. Pastor Reeves' sister, Willie Mae. They call her in for an interview. Investigators ask what she knows in regard to Stephen as well as Latrice. Her version is that Stephen moved in sometime in the summer of 2007 and that she had actually seen Latrice over at her house before January 29th. But she's also aware that she was there that night because when she came home from church around 8:45 or 9, she saw Stephen with Latrice. She also confirms that Pastor Reeves was not present at that time. She went upstairs to watch TV and could hear Stephen and Latrice leave the house around 9:30 or 10. They asked her when the next time she saw Stephen was, and she said when she woke up around 7:15 in the morning, she could hear Stephen in the downstairs bathroom. But she doesn't know what he did after 10 p.m., and she went to bed around midnight or 12:30 in the morning. Nothing occurred during the night. Again, they can't confirm the alibis. She said she did see her brother, Pastor Reeves, sleeping in his bed that morning. Then they asked, "Do you know what time he came back from church?" And she said that she didn't think anyone came home after she had gone to sleep. That includes Pastor Reeves. So now even his alibi doesn't seem to check out. So is everyone just covering for one another? Well, each one of these people that were interviewed were willing to give their DNA, and they were about to get the results back to see if any of them were a match for the evidence pulled from Latrice's car. Meanwhile, they go back to talk to Stephen because they have a lot more information at this point, and they think that they're going to get a confession. But instead, as soon as they start to accuse Stephen of committing this crime and putting this evidence in front of him about him borrowing the vehicle, the DNA results come back in and turn the entire case upside down. Up until this point, they have 3 potential suspects: Darren Curtis, the husband who's without an alibi, whose wife is having an affair. Then there's the man she's having an affair with, Stephen Randolph, the young, good-looking basketball player with a very promising future in the NBA, who was worried they may have gotten Latrice pregnant. And lastly, you've got Pastor Robert Reeves, a man whose car was found near the scene of the crime, but seemingly has no motive to want to hurt this woman. But after the DNA comes back on February 2nd, they quickly make an arrest, but it stuns everyone, especially the public. Pastor Robert Reeves is arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Latrice Curtis. Of course, the pastor is claiming 100% innocence. His sister's shocked. She's like, "Wait a minute, my brother is a man who's partially paralyzed in his left arm." She tells the detectives that her brother had been mugged many years ago back in New York. He was stabbed in his left arm and afterward was never able to fully use it again. He doesn't have a good grip in that hand, he can't pick up anything heavy, and the use of that arm is very minimal. Well, speaking of that arm, when they interviewed Reeves the day prior, they noticed that he had abrasions on his right arm, the good arm, and his knee, and they were fresh wounds. When they questioned him, he said he sustained those injuries when he was helping Stephen move a desk at the house. While both Willie Mae and Stephen confirmed that yes, they moved the desk, both of them said they did not ever see Reeves get hurt. It was those injuries, coupled with the DNA report, that led to his arrest. The car contained a DNA mixture of blood from 2 individuals. However, both Darren and Stephen were ruled out as contributors. But Pastor Reeves, he couldn't be ruled out. The report stated verbatim that the probability that someone other than Pastor Robert Reeves in the North Carolina African American population contributed to the DNA discovered on Latrice's steering wheel was 1 in 147,000 people. So a very slim chance that it was anyone else except for Pastor Reeves. He also has a criminal record that was sexual in nature, but it didn't include any violent crimes. The community seemed to agree that Pastor Reeves was not guilty. Even Latrice's parents were perplexed. Sherman's mind was made up. He thought Darren was the perpetrator, and this arrest divided a lot of people in the community. The congregation is angry. They think the police have the wrong guy. But that's because the police are very tight-lipped about what other evidence may have linked Pastor Reeves to Latrice, and the public had to wait almost a year until the trial to find out what it was. But you don't have to wait that long, because I'm obviously going to tell you exactly what investigators were trying to keep close to their vests. No one was allowed to talk about it, especially Stephen, who used to be their prime suspect but now was about to be one of their prime witnesses, testifying against his former roommate at the end of September 2009 at his trial. What no one knew was that when detectives went in to confront Stephen about the evidence they found regarding him using the pastor's car, he pretty much went off on them. He's like, "Listen, you do not understand. You're looking at the wrong person. I never drove Pastor Reeves's vehicle that night." He admits, yes, he's had to borrow it because his tires were slashed, but that was back on December 11th. it was weeks ago. He says that even though it was expensive, he did get them fixed at least a few days before Latrice was found murdered. There was no reason for him to be borrowing Pastor Reeves's car then. He says if that car was on the scene, it's because Pastor Reeves drove it there. He says, and he's not who you think he is. Really? Well then who is he? He said, look, the guy is weird. They're like, how so? What he says is a huge turning point in this case. He explains that Pastor Reeves is nosy. He's always trying to get up in his business, especially when it comes to women. For the most part, that's not that unusual. A pastor is usually concerned about the well-being of a man he's trying to help, especially considering that premarital sex is seen as a sin in that community. But Stephen goes one step further. He says no, he's not just nosy because I'm dating women or having sex with them or even cheating or anything like that. He's made me feel really uncomfortable in the past. He said that after he moved in with Pastor Reeves, Velma had come over a few times and they had sex together. Pastor Reeves tries to sit down with him, have a conversation like guy talk about sex and all that. Okay, fine. He's a pastor. But then he says something weird. According to Stephen, Pastor Reeves goes, I know you're always looking for money, and you're kinda down on your luck, and you know you're here because you want to save rent. Have you ever considered being a male escort? You're really good looking and it pays well. Okay, so Stephen admits, I was in need of some quick cash. I was kinda thinking over it. I was like, I don't know, maybe. I mean, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility for me. It wasn't out of the question. But he really wasn't sure why the pastor would be bringing this up. The conversation just evolved from there into a very weird topic, where the pastor is basically confiding in him about this fraternity party that he once went to. He said to Steve, I was young once and I was out drinking, having a good time. He went to this fraternity party and he ends up having somebody go down on him. Okay, TMI, I mean, good for you, man. However, the story gets a little weird. It goes to a different place when the lights turned on. Pastor Reeves realized something. What did he realize? Was it an escort or what? Because the conversation is going back and forth. They're having this, quote-unquote guy talk. And in the middle of all this, him telling the story about the lights turning back on, he just turns over to Stephen and says, how big is your junk? Yeah, I know. And Stephen's sitting there thinking, is this pastor serious? Is this about starting this escort business? Well, he thinks so he drops his pants. And that's when the pastor continues the story and says, when the lights came back on at the fraternity party, I realized I was with a man. Okay, the pastor was kind of acting like this wasn't really that big of a deal because he says to Stephen, you know what's crazy? It didn't feel any different than when a woman did it. That's when the pastor grabbed Stephen. You know where. Yeah, he's doing that while saying things about, oh, you could be a male escort, but, sometimes they have to perform with other men, but it's really good money. That's when Stephen started to realize that the pastor was coming on to him. At this point, Stephen was like, okay, this man clearly wants something from me. Either he wants me to do something to him, or he wants to do something to me that I'm not comfortable with. So, Stephen up and leaves the house because he's that uncomfortable. But he does not consider this resolved, so he goes back 10 minutes later, and he makes it very clear to the pastor that he is not interested in any of that in any way. At that point, Pastor Reeves apologizes. He's like, I am so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. This will never happen again. Coming from a pastor, who knows why he said what he said, right? Was he part of some weird kind of male escort ring? What is going on? But there is one thing that's clear. Stephen wanted nothing to do with it. However, that wasn't the end of the conversation or the topic because it was brought up more than once after that. Coincidentally, it was times when Stephen had his girlfriend, Velma, over. It was a way for the pastor to segue into this conversation time and time again. One time saying things like, just because you let a guy do it doesn't mean that you're gay. Another time he said, listen, if you let me do it to you, I'll lower your rent. Or you know what? If you let me do it, I won't even charge you rent. At this point, Stephen had enough. It was actually making him feel more than just uncomfortable. It was to the point where he reached out to his cousin and asked to borrow a 9mm from him, because he figured the next time this happens, the pastor might go one step further from just touching him. This guy's not getting the message. He thought he was going to have to use that 9mm the night Latrice came over, because that was the first time that he and Latrice ever had sex. Apparently, the pastor found out about it. He was there waiting to talk to Stephen about this sexual escapade with a married woman. He pulls Stephen aside into a room, and while they're having this conversation, he brings up the inappropriate topic again. This is right after Latrice had left, and he's questioning him about whether he had just had sex with her. Stephen is like, "Yes, I did." And there was sort of this implication that he shouldn't be doing it with Latrice. He should be doing it with the pastor. Stephen had just had enough. This whole thing was making him really upset. He basically said, "Stop asking me this. Leave me alone. I want nothing to do with you like that." Stephen also tells investigators, "Guess what? Remember those threatening calls and the tire slashing? Well, they started right after the first time I told him no." Then he adds, "You know what? If you don't believe what time I came home, why don't you go check the alarm system?" The detectives are like, "What do you mean by this?" He says, "Well, we all have codes. Each one of us has a different code to get into the residence. I don't know the master code, only Pastor Reeves knows that code. I've been given my own code, and so has Willie May, so go see what time the pastor came home, because I sure as hell know his car wasn't in the driveway when I pulled in." Investigators pull the phone records. They get forensic evidence from the alarm system at the pastor's residence, and it turns out the alarm was armed using Stephen's code around 1:30 a.m. But then at 2:30 a.m. the alarm goes off. It's triggered by someone trying to get back into the house, and it's disarmed within 4 seconds, using the master code. But what really solidified the detectives' theory that Pastor Reeves was the one who killed Latrice was his phone records. They pulled all 3 of them, that's right. The pastor had 3 phones. A house phone, a cell phone, and a fun phone. That's how this man referred to that 3rd phone. This was a phone that was discovered to be being paid for by the church in the church's name, but was clearly being used for things outside of church purposes, for fun. That's what the pastor said. Once it was discovered, one of the things he must have considered fun was harassing Stephen and Velma, because reports revealed that on December 1st, 2007, 6 calls were placed from the fun phone to Velma's number. All of these calls were intentionally blocked so the number wouldn't be revealed. That same day, a call was made from the fun phone to Stephen's phone. On December 11th, the day that Stephen's tires were slashed, 7 blocked calls were made from the fun phone, and 2 calls were also made from the fun phone to Velma's on the day her tires were slashed. So that means Pastor Reeves called both Stephen and Kimberly. It most likely wasn't Latrice. Was he trying to set up some kind of alibi? Was he trying to skew the timeline? We know that he loves to make phone calls. It's just something to think about. Why do you think nothing was said during that time? I don't think that Latrice's phone automatically dialed both of those people, and then it was off after that because it went straight to voicemail. So, he conveniently called those 2 numbers. It's just sick. After all of this evidence came in, they developed a theory, and this was the prosecution's argument at trial about exactly what they thought happened to Latrice and why. In her opening statement, the prosecutor paints a really frightening picture of Pastor Reeves, the opposite of what he's known for, a man that was becoming more and more obsessed with Stephen Randolph. It was that obsession, they believe, that led to Latrice's murder. On the night of January 29th, they believe that after Stephen and Latrice left, Pastor Reeves was overcome with jealousy, continuing to see these women coming in and out of Stephen's room, knowing that it wasn't Stephen that was allowing him to have a piece of him like these women were. So when Latrice left, Robert Reeves, in his jealous rage, followed her along that dark interstate, and somehow he convinced her to pull over. Maybe it's because he's a pastor. Maybe they knew each other. Maybe she thought something was wrong with her car, who knows? But when she pulled over, that's when they believed he took out all of his rage, and all of his jealousy on Latrice. Not once, not twice, not a dozen times, but upwards of 40 times. Because the prosecution believes that somehow, some way, he thought if he got rid of these women, then Stephen would want to be with him. Then Stephen would let him do what he wanted to do to him. It's clear that this man used his authority in the church to do evil things. He used his authority and his position to get people to trust him, only to carry out inappropriate actions. 4 other witnesses also claimed that they had seen cars similar to those owned by Reeves and Latrice together on the highway that night near the scene of the crime. And remember that the trooper reported seeing Pastor Reeves' vehicle at 1:53 a.m. At the trial, an investigator came forward and said that he timed the drive from the location where Latrice's body was found to Reeves's home, leaving at 1:53, a man arriving back at Pastor Reeves' house at 2:23 a.m. This evidence is consistent with the state's theory that Pastor Reeves had time to return home between 1:53 and 2:30 when he used the master code to disarm the alarm at his home. Of course, the defense had their own arguments. They said, oh no, Stephen had much more to gain from getting Latrice out of the picture. There were even pastors coming forward and supporting Pastor Reeves, people from the community saying how amazing he was and how Stephen could have driven Reeves's minivan and used the master code and then lied about not knowing it. However, there were a few things that the defense couldn't argue about. 2 were direct testimonies from 2 other men who had similar situations regarding the pastor's inappropriate comments and behaviors. Another was a piece of evidence that they found at the pastor's home. Police found a receipt for a purchase of a broiling pan on the morning of January 30th. Then they found a partially melted trash can that contained accelerant and fabric, which they believe was burned clothing. They think that the pastor woke up that morning after everyone left, and he needed to get rid of his bloody clothes so that he wouldn't be implicated. So he used that pan to do it, and in the process, as he was throwing the contents away, the trash can was melted. Why else would you have a reason to burn your clothing? But it was the 2 men that came forward that really sealed the deal, LaQuinton Ford and John Ross. LaQuinton testified that while he was working at a kiosk in the mall in 2005, Pastor Reeves began talking to him and offered to give him a ride home because he lived far. It was like 15 to 20 miles away. He took him up on the offer, and he says that when the pastor was driving him home, he started to have guy talk with him. I don't know why they called that. But this included talk about sex with women, which wasn't too out of the ordinary for 2 guys. However, when Pastor Reeves dropped him off at his house, he just asked LaQuinton to know how much he paid for rent. He says, $100 a month. The pastor goes, well, you could come stay with me for free. Initially, LaQuinton says no, but then later he starts having issues with his living arrangements and he decides to take him up on the offer, and he moves in with the pastor. He's a pastor. You're not expecting him to be sinister. But while they're living together, Pastor Reeves goes out of town. LaQuinton is there by himself. He's house-sitting. He's taking care of the pastor's dog. Well, he invites his girlfriend over, and they have sex. He places a used condom in a grocery bag that he uses as a trash can and puts it on the doorknob outside his bedroom door. Well, a little while after Pastor Reeves had gone home from his trip, the bag is gone, seemingly thrown away. But then he confronts LaQuinton and he asks him, has anyone been over my house? LaQuinton says no, and the pastor is like, really? So why was there a used condom in the trash can? Kinda weird. After this, he goes on to tell LaQuinton how mad he is that he had someone over having sex when he wasn't there. But then just a couple of nights after that, Pastor Reeves has the same conversation with LaQuinton that he had with Stephen about starting an escort service. He tells him the exact same thing. You can't tell the difference between a man or a woman. LaQuinton got so upset, he walked away and called his mom to tell her everything that was going on. Well, Pastor Reeves wasn't too happy about this rejection because he tells LaQuinton, now you have to pay rent. At this point, LaQuinton had been in a really bad situation because he had nowhere else to go. When he showed up at work the next day, he was arrested. The pastor told police that he had damaged his property and he filed charges against him. Luckily, they were later dismissed. But do you see a similar pattern here? Well, if not, listen to what John Ross had to say at trial. Don't worry, we are wrapping up. John Ross had a similar story. He said he was working as an installation technician for the home alarm system service. He came by Pastor Reeves' house in October of 2007 because he was having the alarm system installed. Well, John arrives around 8 o'clock in the morning. Guess who's there? Stephen. And while Stephen's there, the pastor is wearing a suit. 15 minutes after Stephen leaves, the pastor changes into a sleeveless undershirt and a pair of shorts. Then he comes into the room and starts talking to John about sex, which then leads the pastor to ask John if he's ever considered being a male escort, because he's got some really good features. The pastor doesn't even hesitate after that. He just straight up asked him, "How big is your junk?" Then he says, "Have you ever let a man go down on you?" John is just so uncomfortable that he tries to leave, but he can't because Pastor Reeves grabs him by the wrist and pulls him into the house towards the bathroom. What he says next? John says the Pastor Reeves said, "Just close your eyes and you won't know. Just let me do what I gotta do and I'll give you some money for it and you can go." Wow. Well, he was able to pull away from his grip and left. He left everything there too, the wiring, the paperwork, everything was inside, and he just ran. So it turns out that even though the pastor supposedly has paralysis in his left arm, it looks like he's able to use his right arm perfectly fine, and he's actually willing to become physical with someone when he doesn't get his way. But not only that, there are criminal charges to prove it. Even though those weren't allowed to be submitted as evidence in the trial, Pastor Reeves has engaged in illegal activities that include inappropriate and unwanted sexual conduct. As a matter of fact, he left a church that he used to work at, Pleasant Hill Baptist Church in South Carolina, because he was accused of that type of conduct with a boy who wasn't even an adult yet. He was charged with conduct of the same nature on September 3rd, 1987 in South Carolina. Later, he was convicted of a third-degree charge of that nature in 1988. When I say third-degree charge, I know you might not know what that means, but you'll hear it over and over again, especially in cases that revolve around this type of action. It means that it involves someone who is not an adult and an act that they don't want done. Reeves was also charged with battery in 1982 in South Carolina, and these accusations of the same type of conduct were said to have surfaced in New York while he was working there after it happened in South Carolina. So he just moved to another church and the sick cycle began again. Just a few years before Latrice's murder, Pastor Reeves was charged again with sexual misconduct on July 13, 2002. So how does a man like this continue to work in churches? Well, these churches have their own way, so no one has to do a check on them. And that's exactly what Pastor Reeves was doing in this current community in North Carolina. He was charismatic, seen as a visionary, a loyal man of faith, and a gifted preacher. But now he's seen for his true colors. He's a killer. He's a killer who used his authority and position in his church to get what he wanted. And when he didn't, he took a beautiful, innocent woman out of this world. For that, he will spend the rest of his life in prison because the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. These kinds of cases make me so upset. The fact that someone can use authority, especially under the guise of a person who's supposed to be there for you to mentor you, help you, and guide you, but all they're doing is guiding you into darkness, and even ending someone's life on account of not getting what they want. Spring break, it's the time of year when the rules of our everyday routines don't matter, when we can leave behind the stresses of work and school and embrace the freedom of the moment. It's a time for adventure and excitement, for spontaneous road trips and lazy afternoons basking in the sun. That's exactly what Christine Lazaro was looking forward to on her spring break. What she didn't expect was that it would be her last adventure and she wouldn't be coming home alive. Let's get into Christine Lazaro. She was born on August 8, 1972 in Rochester, New York, to her mother Kathleen and her father Frank. She was the middle child of 3 children. She had an older brother, Frank III, named after his dad and grandpa. He was 2 years older than Christine, and she had a little sister, Daniel Lynn, who came 9 years later in 1981. Around 1984, the family moved to a quaint suburb of the city of Rochester called Irondequoit. The population was about 50,000 at the time. It's known to have big city culture but small city charm, and its name means where the land and the water meet. It does border Lake Ontario just south of Toronto and Ottawa, Canada. Living in this part of New York, the summers are warm, but the winters are freezing, snowy, and windy, and it's partly cloudy all year long. Over the course of the year, the temperatures can vary from 18 degrees Fahrenheit to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's only warm from about June to August. Then it's back to living in the cold. The snowy season there lasts for 5 months. When Christine, who by the way went by Chrissy, was just a kid, her parents actually split up. They got a divorce. It was hard on her and her family, but a thing about Chrissy is she was always looking on the bright side. She made the best of every situation, and she had always been a daddy's girl, especially after the divorce. Her dad would say that Chrissy was sugar and spice and everything nice, but of course, she was wearing jeans and a baseball cap. He was so proud of his little girl. Despite things not working out with her mom, Frank truly believed he had done everything right with Chrissy, and she was turning into an amazing young lady. He even wrote a poem about Chrissy as she was growing up, and this is what it said. "Somewhere between a girl and a woman, this gift of God stands. She's a rose, a ray of sunshine, joy and laughter wrapped in lace or jeans, a treasure to hold, yet one to share." Her dad also said that she had an excitement for life that was contagious. It must have been true because she attracted a lot of people her way. Chrissy was very popular among all types of groups of people growing up. She was very fun, and you'd know when she came into a room, mostly because of her looks first. She looked like she could be a model. She had long, wavy brown hair, a big smile, high cheekbones, and green eyes. But it was Chrissy's personality that made her even more beautiful. She was just fun. She had a goofy, silly side. You can tell in this photo, she's all dolled up with friends but making a funny face at the camera. Speaking of being dolled up, Chrissy had dreams of becoming a fashion designer. She was very stylish. She loved doing her hair, her makeup, picking out the perfect outfit, and her eye for detail and unique style made her stand out. She always wanted to make sure that everything was just right. She took pride in her appearance, and her dad encouraged her to go after what she was passionate about. So when it came time to choose a college, Chrissy's choice was to study fashion design at the local Monroe Community College, which was only 15 minutes away from where she lived. By 1993, she was 20 years old. She was going to school, and she was working part-time as a waitress at Galveston's Restaurant and Bar on East Ridge Road. It's right here, 2 minutes away from her house. Very convenient. It had opened in the fall, and Chrissy had been working there for 6 months since its grand opening. Chrissy was perfect for this job. She was very bubbly. She would jump from table to table, enthusiastically welcoming guests as they sat down and trying to make friends with each and every one. Tim Piccolo was her assistant manager at the time, and he'd say that the group of about 20 of them, the employees, they all loved Chrissy. They were like a big family, and she was a hard worker. She had a good reason to be. She was saving up to move into her own apartment, but she didn't plan to be alone. It was going to be a place that she would share with her very best friends, the 3 girls who knew Chrissy the best: Rita Filipponi, Lauren Marotti, and Kelly Pagoni. They were inseparable for many years. They did everything together. If you saw one of them, you saw all of them, because they would go everywhere as a group. That's another thing Christine took pride in, being a good friend, a loyal friend, somebody you could always count on. For her, friends meant the world. By early 1993, Chrissy had just started dating a guy named Carl Jeffries. He played minor league baseball, and she was pretty smitten. Her dad approved as well. He liked the way Carl was very gentlemanlike. He would open the doors for his daughter, and he was very well-mannered, and Frank really liked that about him. Not many guys still do that, by the way. She enjoyed Carl's company, but they were just starting their romance. It wasn't serious just yet, especially since Carl wasn't around that much. He was very busy with his baseball career and spent most of his time in South Carolina practicing with his team, so they didn't really get to see much of each other. But when they both had spare time, they enjoyed spending it together. And that was okay, because Chrissy was very busy herself, juggling college, work, and of course hanging out with the girls. They were planning a really fun trip to Florida for spring break. Their sunny destination, Daytona Beach, Florida. It's the perfect place to enjoy fun in the sun and so much more. Chrissy loved the beach, and she didn't get to go very often because, like I said, the closest one was probably about 300 miles away. So all she did was talk about this trip. She couldn't wait to get her toes in the sand and bake in the sun. She liked getting a nice bronze suntan, and Daytona is like paradise for someone living in colder weather. Snowbirds flock to the Sunshine State to escape the frigid weather up north. It's true that Florida beaches are the perfect location to spend your time looking for that tropical vacation experience, but with so many other, more popular destinations like Miami or Fort Lauderdale, I wondered, how did this small coastal town, that's not even in the middle of the Panhandle, become so popular? Leave it to MTV, of course. In 1986, MTV made its first trip to Daytona Beach with the debut of their new show called MTV Spring Break. It launched at the Plaza Hotel in Daytona Beach. This was a live show that MTV used to broadcast for 8 hours a day during spring break. It featured live music performances by famous bands and musicians, plus all the other spring break-related antics, bikini-clad women, alcohol, and lots of hot-looking co-eds. The president of MTV at that time, Doug Herzog, said this about being at spring break. He said, "Spring break is a youth culture event, and we wanted to be part of it for that reason. It makes good sense for us to come down and go live from the center of it because obviously, the people that are there are the kinds of people who watch MTV." And it's true, they were definitely hitting their demographic. By the 1980s, other coastal cities in Florida, like Fort Lauderdale, started to discourage college students from spending their spring and summer breaks on their beaches. It brought a lot of destruction, crime, and chaos to the beautiful cities, while the mayor of Daytona at the time, Larry Kelly, saw this as an opportunity to have his town on the map and invite tourists to his beach instead. It was all about business, but sometimes seeing green can blur your vision to the dangers and downsides of such an open invitation. Daytona actually started to market itself as the destination for spring break for tourists back in 1989. It was a huge moneymaker. A typical spring break in Daytona brought in $160 million back then, in a mere 3-month period, and an estimated 400,000 spring break vacationers, mostly college-aged individuals, who came there to run wild. And I can tell you this, the locals were not fans of this at all. In 1993, the biggest stars at the time were performing on MTV's Spring Break show. Joey Lawrence, I remember him, was the host, and some of the performers were Warren G. on his regular tour, Stone Temple Pilots, Eminem, Exhibit, and Dr. Dre, just to name a few. Of course, this was a major event. Just look at this picture. This is a bird's eye view of one of those performances in what they called the band shell. It kind of looks like a castle, and look at all of those people. However, Chrissy and her friends weren't going to Daytona for MTV, they just wanted everything else that came with the spring break capital that MTV had put on the map. Chrissy's trip wasn't until April, which was about a month after MTV was going to be there. It wasn't just the core group of girls making their way 1,000 miles from New York to Daytona, it was a group of 17 of them, guys and girls. The plan? Driving separate vehicles as somewhat of a caravan and getting a bunch of hotel rooms at a really cool hotel that's close to the beach and has everything. They picked the Howard Johnson Hotel on Atlantic Boulevard. It's right on the beach, just steps away from the ocean. Just look at these views. It makes me miss Florida. It's called the Plaza Resort and Spa now, but it's close to everything. Lots of bars, restaurants, clubs, music venues, and of course, lots of other spring breakers there for the exact same reasons. The road it's on, A1A, is lined with hotels and gift shops catering to out-of-towners, and it was the perfect choice for Chrissy's group. So, what did Frank think of this? His 20-year-old daughter taking a trip so far away from home. Well, he trusted Chrissy. Even though he said she could be impetuous at times, like most young adults are, she was also responsible and firmly grounded. Just 5 weeks prior to the trip, her father was proudly sharing the fact that he was so overjoyed that Chrissy had accepted Christ into her life. Besides that, they were going as a group. What could happen to a group of them? It was as though a piece of home was coming with Chrissy. They'd have one another. They'd be safe. On Friday, April 9th, 1993, the group of 17 Rochester guys and gals arrived at the beautiful Daytona Beach, Florida beaches to spend the next week having the time of their lives. Chrissy and the girls checked into their room on the 13th floor, and I'm sure there was an amazing view. Then they made their way down to A1A to get acquainted with the place they'd call home for the next several days. By the next day, Saturday, they were ready for their first full beach day and party night. They didn't really want to go out the night before because they wanted to be well rested and ready to dance all night long at the most popular nightclub in Daytona, Razzles, at 611 Seabreeze Boulevard. They saved their energy for Saturday night, which was also one of the busiest and best nights to go there. It's still a super popular venue today. Their website says Razzles is Daytona Beach's hottest nightclub and has been electrifying Daytona Beach for over 3 decades. There's even a dedicated spring break tab on the website where you can click to see what to expect when visiting Razzles, which they say is the spring break headquarters for over 35 years. It definitely looks like a party to me. It even advertises free drinks until 10 p.m. This place is packed most nights, where you're literally crammed in shoulder to shoulder. Their Facebook page as of February 22nd of this year was looking for security guards for this upcoming spring break season, so it's still jamming. The place is huge too. It's over 15,000 square feet. There are a number of different rooms, tables, booths, lounges, VIP sections, bars, and dance floors to choose from. The best part? It was only a 2-minute walk from their hotel, right around the corner, which made it super convenient, especially after drinking all night at Razzles. You can be 18 to enter, but you must be 21 to consume alcohol. Chrissy was only 20, but she brought a fake ID with her from New York so that she could bypass the restrictions. Back in those days, it was really easy to get your hands on a fake ID. Not only that, but they look completely different than the driver's licenses today. After spending all afternoon at the beach, the girls headed up to their room. They showered, did their hair and makeup, got dressed, and then headed out in their group to Razzles around 9 p.m. As soon as the doors opened, they got a table, ordered their drinks, and started dancing the night away. There's a lot to see and experience in a big nightclub like this. Lots of new people, loud music. Though they did come as a group together, they weren't glued to one another all night. Last call was announced, and the group met back up at the table. That's when they noticed that Chrissy wasn't there. Her friend, Rita, jumped into action immediately. During the night, the girls had been separated a number of times, but each time they made their way back together, so Rita just figured that Chrissy was somewhere in the crowd. She went looking around, asking friends if they had seen her, and one of their friends from the group said they remembered seeing her around midnight, talking to a guy and leaving with him out the front door. Rita and the girls did remember seeing Chrissy walk off a couple of times, but figured, you know what, she's going to be back. Of course, when you're busy having fun, time kind of slips away, and you don't always keep track of your adult friends' whereabouts. As a matter of fact, none of them were even concerned about Chrissy leaving. In their minds, she was living it up, having a good time, and maybe continuing the fun elsewhere. No big deal. So they made the 2-minute walk back to their hotel, figuring she would surely show up soon. At some point, the girls drifted off to sleep, and by the next day, Easter morning, on Sunday, April 11th, Chrissy still wasn't back. They didn't have cell phones back then, so they couldn't reach out by text or call her. There was no social media or Find My Device apps. All you could do was wait. So that's what they did. They were going to wait until Chrissy made her way back to the room. The girls asked some of their other Rochester friends if Chrissy had crashed with them in their hotel rooms, but she had not. They knew their friend, and they figured, you know what? She's probably having a little too much fun with the guy she met the night before. If something was wrong, they figured Chrissy would have called the hotel by now. They were a little surprised that Chrissy would choose a guy she didn't know over spending her vacation with her best friends. But they figured, what could they do, right? It was her choice. They weren't going to wait around and let the sun go down without getting out there on the beach and enjoying every minute of it. So, they left the room and headed out to the sand, assuming they'd see Chrissy anytime now, prancing down the shoreline with a story to tell them about last night. They still really were not that concerned at all, but they should have been. What Chrissy's best friends didn't know was that earlier that same morning, around 7:06 a.m., 30 miles southwest, in a sleepy bedroom community called DeBerry. I've heard that phrase before, but I never knew what it meant. A bedroom town refers to a small town tucked away from the city. It's a place where people move for cheaper rent, but it's close enough to commute into town for work. They live there basically just to sleep, and they spend most of their time elsewhere. Makes sense. I'd never heard of this town before either. It's located in Volusia County, about 45 minutes inland from the hotel where the girls were staying, and this area is definitely like night and day compared to Daytona Beach. much more residential, rural in nature, spread out with way less going on. That Easter morning, a resident was on his way to work when he saw a flash of something white in the grass along a very busy road called Turkston Drive. It was out of place enough for him to stop and take a closer look, so he did. From his vantage point, he thought he could see a woman lying on the ground. He raced to the nearest convenience store to call 911. Officers made their way out to the road just outside a wooded residential neighborhood, and sure enough, they saw something that appeared to be a deceased human body. A few minutes later, Officer Greg Arthur, a crime scene investigator from the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, got a phone call. They told him to go out to the scene. It was the supervisor of the major case unit that handles homicides in that area. Officer Arthur had been to many crime scenes. He had seen his fair share of very gruesome murders, but he had to compose himself when he arrived on the scene in DeBary that holiday morning in 1993. Seeing her just lying there, curled up on her side, the strikingly beautiful woman, there was just something about it, like a sleeping beauty frozen in that moment, lifeless yet with the air of potential she could have had in life, had she had the chance to live it. The officer was overcome with emotion. This was someone's child. He had so many questions, but he had to pull it together so that he could find the answers. The first thing he noticed was the blood. It contrasted against the white baseball jersey that she was wearing. She had it on, in this picture, with a pair of shorts taken the night before. Hours earlier, she was smiling and laughing with friends, and now it was soaked with her blood. It was pooling underneath her head. She still had her purse in her hand. What was she doing on this road? And who would have wanted to harm her? It was clear that she had been shot, and it appeared the wounds were on her head, but there were no other distinctive marks on her body. Could she have been walking here at night and been ambushed by someone? There was a very noticeable and fresh tire track right next to her body in the grass, so Officer Arthur used a cement-like substance to make an impression of this track. While the coroner arrived to transport the woman's remains to the medical examiner's office, they also recovered a spent shell casing, which was located around 4 feet away from where she had been lying. Since her purse was collected at the scene, they were able to look inside and get their first lead, a clue about her identity. But it wasn't crystal clear who she was because they found 2 New York State identification cards, one with information about a 26-year-old woman, and the other for a woman named Christine Lazaro, who was only 20. Now Officer Arthur thinks he knows who their victim is, the young girl, the 20-year-old in town for spring break. It doesn't take long for him to match her face to the younger woman's ID, and it makes sense. She would have wanted to have this fake ID so she could drink, especially because she was on this vacation from out of state. It's not uncommon at all. Plus, there was a big clue on the top of her hands, stamps from a nightclub. But she's so far from anywhere with a happening nightlife, so it's a mystery how she ended up this far inland. The officer knows she was most likely staying in Daytona. Now he has the dreadful task of notifying next of kin about the devastating reality that their loved one is dead. Frank was the first one to get that call. It was unbelievable to him. He kept saying, "No, no, no." That's all he could get out of his mouth. There wasn't anything else to say. It was going to take him a while to come to terms with what the officer was telling him, and they still did not have much information to provide. However, Frank was able to give them some information. He confirmed what Arthur had suspected. Chrissy was on a trip to Daytona Beach with her friends. He gave the officer the name and location of the hotel they were staying at. Chrissy's brother didn't get the chance to hear about his sister's death from a loved one. He saw it on the news. He said he would never forget seeing the EMTs loading a body bag into an ambulance, and that had to be extremely devastating. I cannot begin to imagine the pain of someone you love dying tragically, but to find out about it on TV like that, I can't help but feel so sorry for him. Meanwhile, back in Daytona, it was close to 5 p.m. when the trio made their way back to the hotel room from spending the day at the beach. They had to be back to get ready for dinner reservations that they had made before the trip. They had planned a nice Easter dinner at a fancy restaurant. But where is Chrissy at this point? The girls start to talk about how they're feeling in regards to the fact that they feel like Chrissy has just abandoned them and all their plans on this planned vacation. It was a holiday, and they were all looking forward to this night. Chrissy had helped pick out the restaurant, planned the event, and she even set out a special dress. It was hanging in the closet. So what's going on? What could be more important than this plan with her closest friends? They just didn't understand it, and it started to annoy them. They were just trying to make sense of it all. I mean, they weren't thinking that their best friend was dead, that's for sure. They thought that she had opted to spend time with someone else. Detective Jody Palermo was assigned as the lead detective on the case. He didn't understand what a spring breaker in Daytona would be doing in DeBary, nearly an hour away from the beaches, and why she was just left there, not even covered up. It was as though she was dumped out of the side of a car door and just left there, thrown away like trash, and that was heartbreaking. What could she have done to make someone do this to her? Well, the only lead he has is the information given to them by Chrissy's father, so they made their way to the Howard Johnson's hotel, looking for her friends. Time is not on their side. Those first 24 to 48 hours are crucial, and it had already been 16 hours by the time they set out to find her friends. Kelly, Lauren, and Rita had made it to dinner, but there was just this eerie feeling around them. Rita had this wave of fear come over her at one point. She couldn't just sit there anymore enjoying this night without Chrissy. She turned to the other two girls and said, "This is serious. Something isn't right. Something's wrong. We gotta go." And they left to go back to their hotel. That gut feeling was right. When they got to their door, they saw a business card in their hotel room door. It was from Detective Palermo. At this point, they felt a little relieved, but then it turned to concern, like, what did Chrissy get herself into now? The girls were thinking she got arrested, maybe for having a fake ID or something worse. They didn't have much time to put it together though, because just as they stepped inside, the investigators were back at their hotel room door. Without hesitation, one of the investigators pulled them together and said, "Girls, there's no easy way to say this. Christine is dead." That's unbelievable. It was so difficult for them to hear this. That is not what they were expecting. All three of them just stood there, speechless. They were in shock. Their minds went completely blank. They didn't know what was going on. Rita actually thought the detective might have been speaking a different language. It sounded foreign to her because it wasn't making sense. But when she looked towards Kelly and Lauren, she knew and just broke down. All three of them broke down, hysterically crying. There were so many emotions and thoughts racing through their heads. Shock, guilt, sadness, and then the realization that they'd never see Chrissy again. They'd never hear her laugh or ask for her style advice. They were so young and alone, far from home, and now knowing their best friend was never going back home with them, it was a lot for them to take in. But there was no time to grieve in that moment, because detectives needed the girls to pull themselves together to help them understand what happened to their friend. The girls explained the last time they saw Chrissy. It was the night before at Razzles. They didn't see her leave, but friends of theirs said that she left the club with a dark-skinned male. He could have been Hispanic or African American, but he wasn't someone from their group. However, they did say this: Carl, the guy Chrissy had been seeing, matched that description. He was African American, but he was supposed to be in North Carolina. Still, it was only a 6-hour drive, so could he have surprised her and come to Daytona? By 7 p.m., the autopsy report had come back. The manner of death was homicide, and the cause of death was 2 gunshot wounds to the head. There were no signs of forced intercourse or any other physical harm to Chrissy's body. No defensive wounds, nothing. However, the medical examiner did find something on Chrissy's body, a clue left behind. Remember the stamp I mentioned on her hand from Razzles? The medical examiner could still see the R on one of her hands. But on the other hand, there was another stamp, one that her friends didn't have. It wasn't from Razzles. It was smudged, but he was able to make out 3 numbers. 701. That's the name of another hot spot in Daytona Beach, 701 South, a nightclub inside the Texan Hotel on Atlantic Avenue. Present day, the hotel is called the Harbor Beach Resort. It's about a 6-minute drive from Razzles, or about a 29-minute walk. So now investigators know Chrissy wasn't just at Razzles that night, which means the guy she left with might not have been the last person to see her alive. She could have met up with a lot of people. This case is becoming very confusing because there doesn't seem to be a motive. It's hard to imagine why someone would want Chrissy dead. They do have somewhat of a description to go off of, so now they can canvass the area where the body was found, plus the 2 nightclubs, hoping that someone saw or heard something the night before. Maybe someone would recognize Chrissy and remember who she was with, or if anything was out of the ordinary, if there was anything suspicious or wrong with her or anyone she was with. Then they get a lead. One of the servers at Razzles says she 100% remembers Chrissy. She even told detectives what Chrissy was wearing that night. "Oh, I remember her. She was wearing a white baseball jersey, had long dark wavy hair, and shorts on. She was with a black guy. They were sitting right at my bar together right here, and he was wearing a dark blue shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. The server said they were having a very good time, very close. They looked like a couple. The guy was very polite, buying her drinks. Everything looked normal. Wow, okay, so this really did sound like it could be Carl. Maybe he came to surprise her after all. So they get the credit card receipt from the server, and when they look, they see the guy signing with the initials BC. That's definitely not Carl's initials. The server pulls up even more receipts, and they see that the full name is Brent Cole. So they contact the credit card company, pull up all of Brent's information, and find out he's a college student from Minnesota. They figure this guy was probably vacationing in Daytona, just like so many other students that week. Now they need to track him down ASAP, because this could be Chrissy's killer. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood where Chrissy's body was found, a resident said she remembered hearing a bang around 4:30 in the morning, followed by the sound of a vehicle racing away. She returned from Easter Sunday service later that afternoon, and that's when she saw the crime scene tape. She connected it to the gunshots from earlier that morning. But another resident said gunshots were super common in the early morning. It's a rural area, and hunters are out there shooting vermin. It wasn't much to go on. They were just trying to create a timeline, tentatively saying that Chrissy could have been murdered around 4 a.m. By the next day, Rita, Lauren, and Kelly had decided to take the 1,000-mile trip back home, ending their spring break vacation early. They couldn't cope with Chrissy's death all the way in Florida, far from their loved ones. Of course, their families were worried about them. They felt so guilty about not being there to protect their friend. They worried about Chrissy's family and the pain that they were going through. They just had to get back in town. It was equally as hard to leave, though, because this was the last place that they spent time with Chrissy, and they knew she would never be going back home. Not alive, anyway. Frank definitely wasn't taking a while. I don't know him personally, of course not, but from the interviews and everything I read and watched, he reminded me of my own father. He couldn't help but want to get down there to Florida himself and start looking for the man who killed his little girl. But then he said to himself, "What am I going to do? I'm just going to go door to door and say, 'Did you kill my daughter?'" So he realized this wasn't logical. He wouldn't be much help. It was so hard to sit back and do nothing. He was angry, sad, and anxious to know what happened to Chrissy. Investigators were about to knock on Brent Cole's apartment door at this time. Without warning, they had already made their way to Minnesota. They couldn't wait to get a good look at this guy who was last seen with Chrissy Lazaro. When he came to the door, he was well-dressed, clean-cut, polite, not what they were initially expecting to see. He agreed to speak with them. They informed him that they were there to investigate a murder, and he looked really confused, like, why in the world would these guys be coming all the way here? They informed him, "This is the woman we're looking for, Chrissy Lazaro." And of course, when someone hears that they're being interviewed about a murder, it makes them nervous. In Brent's case, confused. He's like, "I don't have anything to do with that." He's looking at the picture, and he denies knowing Chrissy or anything about what happened to her. He was in Daytona. He says he was on spring break and did go to Razzle's nightclub. He also had drinks with an attractive brunette that night, but she's alive and well. Jennifer Weathers, his girlfriend. The detectives weren't going to just take him at his word, but he goes one step forward and says, "Look, here's a picture of that night of me and my girlfriend." When Detective Palermo looked at that picture of Jennifer, his jaw dropped. He could not believe the resemblance to Chrissy. It was unbelievable. They could have been twins, and they were wearing the exact same outfit that night. Wow. Jennifer was there to speak to the detective herself, and she explained that they were there on that Saturday night, having drinks at the bar together, but they didn't see Chrissy, and they went back to their hotel room together. So now everything that the detectives thought they knew about Chrissy leaving the club wasn't accurate. Her friends most likely caught a quick glimpse of Jennifer and Brent, not Chrissy and another guy, leaving together. But she did go to the 701 club that night without her friends. How'd she get there, though, and who was she with? The friends were re-interviewed, and though they were given this new information, they held strong to the fact they knew they saw Chrissy leave with a dark-skinned man that night, and they knew it was her. Regardless of whether there was another couple that looked similar, they definitely saw Chrissy leave with a similar-looking guy. The detectives went to the 701 club, and they asked the staff if they recognized Chrissy. They brought a picture with them and showed it to all of the people, especially the bouncer, the manager at the door. The manager recognized Chrissy right away, and there's a reason. It was because of the guy she was with that night. He was giving the bouncer issues. As soon as they walked up to the door, his ID didn't quite look right, and the bouncer wanted to ask him a few questions. This guy kinda took offense to it. He snapped back at the bouncer. It's the manager's job to keep her patrons safe, and she looked at Chrissy and could tell she was nervous and scared. At that point, the manager made a mental note of this guy's appearance in case anything else were to happen inside the club that night. He was muscular, medium built. He had high cheekbones, dark skin, a mustache, and what she described as having a very distinctive Arsenio Hall-style haircut. Now, if you're not familiar, he was a famous comedian and talk show host back then, and to me, it's like a high, flat top fade. Tell me what you think. Here's the picture. As you can see, it's unique and distinctive. You'd definitely remember it if you saw it. So now that they have this feature to go on, they interviewed the staff members from the 701 South Club, and they recalled seeing Chrissy and the guy having a great time together. He was a complete gentleman. She definitely wasn't there against her will. But since they had seen him get kind of loud with the bouncer, who knows what he was capable of? Maybe he had a short fuse, and something happened after he had a few drinks in him, and they left the bar. The manager was able to provide a sketch artist with every detail that she could recall, and they created a composite and started taking it all over the town, asking if anyone had seen this man with Chrissy. No luck, so they released the sketch to the media. Now, this is the one I was able to dig up from old newspaper articles. The ones that I saw on shows were completely different, so I truly believe that this is the one they handed out and plastered all over the news, and it started to bring in a bunch of tips. One was from a guy who said he had seen this man. He frequented strip clubs, according to this guy, up and down the coast of Florida, last seen in Orange County. So this is the biggest lead that they've had at this time. Investigators go and they hand out flyers with Chrissy's picture and this guy's picture to clubs, regular clubs, bars, and even strip clubs from Daytona to Orange County, which was about an hour away towards the Orlando area. But they still do not get any leads. On October 17th, a week after Chrissy's body was found, she had been sent back to her family in New York, and they were finally able to lay her to rest. They had a beautiful memorial service at Pittsford Community Church, and over 500 people came out to mourn the loss of Christine Lazaro. Childhood friends, college friends, family, relatives, co-workers, they piled into the church to pay their respects. Frank was blown away. He said, "Holy cow," when he looked at the crowd. However, Chrissy's mom, Kathleen, declined to participate in the service. A family representative said she was not ready to talk about what happened, so she sat at the back of the church. She was too overwhelmed by her daughter's death, and she wanted to grieve privately. There were about 20 people who spoke about their memories of Chrissy and what she meant to them. Frank said that Chrissy was trusting and curious. She embraced life and explored it. But he had a message for everyone, something he thought Chrissy would have wanted them to hear, a word of wisdom and caution so that her loss was not in vain. He said that she would have wanted her friends to learn from her murder. His message was, don't drink and drive, don't do drugs, and don't make hasty decisions, with an emphasis on the last one. Frank said, I know for a fact, she would say, use the buddy system. This was in reference to the fact that Chrissy broke away from her friends. She was left alone. If someone would have been with her, if someone would have been watching, if they would have used the buddy system to alert one another of their plans to leave and not have left anyone behind, she might still be there. Her dad was haunted by his daughter's voice. He imagined her calling out to him in her final moments saying, Daddy, Teddy, help me, and knowing that he couldn't be there for her. That just broke my heart. It's gut-wrenching. A friend of Chrissy's named Brad Denker didn't want to speak at the actual funeral, but he did send a poem into the newspaper that he wrote about Chrissy, and I wanted to read it to you. I remember a face of beauty with eyes that would grab your heart, and a smile that shined like a star in a blackened sky, sounds of laughter and kindness that could enchant a room and bestow happiness on those around her. He ended with, we love you, Chrissy. She was very loved and lost way too soon. Detectives were determined to find the person who did this to her, but every lead that they had went cold. That's when they turned to someone more closer to home, Chrissy's boyfriend, Carl. He did somewhat match the description, and he was only 6 hours away at the time, so they tracked him down to ask him about his whereabouts the week Chrissy was in Florida. His coach made a statement with proof of a roster that showed that Carl was in South Carolina playing a game the night that Chrissy was murdered. But still, there were hours after that were unaccounted for. so they still needed to speak with Carl himself. And it was a good thing they did, because when they do, they get their next lead. They fly out to South Carolina to meet with him, and he's visibly distraught. Just like Frank mentioned, Carl is very polite. He cooperated fully. Unbelievably, he tells the detectives he spoke to Chrissy the night she was murdered. No, he wasn't in Daytona, but she called him sometime in the middle of the night. He was asleep when he answered, and he estimated it was between midnight and 2 a.m. She sounded just fine and bubbly, happy. She told him she was having a great time, but she missed him and wanted to reach out and say hello. He said they chatted for about 30 minutes. Detectives asked if he could tell where she was calling from, and he said he was sleeping and there wasn't much he could say. He didn't hear a lot of loud noise in the background. It wasn't a bar, but he could hear a TV on, and he didn't hear anyone else. Back then, in order to make a long-distance phone call, especially when you're out of town, you bought what's called a calling card. It basically has minutes on it, and you type in a number before the number that you want to call and be connected to, and that's how you pay for long-distance charges. While Chrissy had one of these, they traced the calling card, and they see that late-night call. It was at 1:30 in the morning, but they can't trace where it came from. But the 701 South Club is in the Texan Hotel, and the timeline would match up. If Chrissy left Razzles around midnight and made her way to the Texan, she could have placed that call either before going to that club or afterward. Maybe she was with someone that was staying at the Texan, and she was in their room. It had been 10 days, and they were still no closer to knowing what happened to Chrissy. And that's when Chrissy's friends gave detectives some information that they thought was not that important in the beginning, but maybe now it would be. Remember the first night the girls got there, and they kinda laid low? Well, Chrissy kind of didn't. She went down to the hotel bar all by herself to get a drink alone, and when she came back, she told the girls that she met a really hot bartender named Scott Henson. Now, the girls had already mentioned this to the police, but when they said he was white, they ruled him out because it wasn't a priority to check on, since she was seen with a dark-skinned man leaving the club that night, or so they thought. Chrissy's friend said that she and Scott had exchanged numbers. They planned to meet up sometime that week. But Chrissy couldn't wait. She decided to go out with him that night, after her shift ended. However, she came back alive and told her friends that they just walked down the beach and talked. They go to speak with Scott at the hotel bar, and he admits, "Yeah, I went out on a late-night walk with Chrissy." When they show him a picture, that's when it finally hits him that she's the spring breaker they found murdered on Easter morning. He tells investigators he was not even in town that day. He left early Saturday morning, a day before her body was found, to celebrate the holiday with his family out in Georgia. They confirmed his alibi. By now, all the locals in Daytona Beach are scared. Chrissy's death happened the last week of spring break when many of the students that flocked to this area were finally leaving, and her murder started a debate, including the mayor, who was now realizing that Daytona's reputation as a place to go and let loose and party till you pass out with uncontrollable crowds was really damaging the city's image. He felt it put an undue burden on the police and the community workers who had to clean up all the mess that was left behind. But others in town, who wanted their town to thrive, pointed out that it brought in way too much money to worry about that, and it would make up for all the troubles that the spring breakers may bring. They pointed out there hadn't been a murder in 13 years. Sure, there were petty crimes and hotels got trashed, but they argued, did anyone turn up dead until now? No. Well, an officer named A.J. Tolley from the Daytona Beach Police Department said, "Listen, the reports of men forcing women to have sex with them against their will and other indecent incidents were being reported more and more. In just March alone, there were a dozen reports. It doesn't look good for the city, but more importantly, these are victims, and they're coming forward. And yes, someone did die." Just 2 days afterward, there was already a headline in the front page of a local newspaper that said, "Time to de-emphasize spring break." It looks like the mayor got more than he bargained for when all he saw was dollar signs chasing after those MTV viewers. The case they were referring to that happened 13 years before this was the murder of Carol Ann Barrett. She was an 18-year-old from Ohio who was on spring break in Daytona in March of 1980. Just like Chrissy, she had dreamed of spending her vacation in the sun. She also traveled with a group of 8 of her friends, and they all stayed at the Treasure Island Inn Hotel on the beach, just like the one Chrissy's friends were in. In Carol's case, she was partying in her hotel room with her group of friends when she and a guy decided to leave and go to a store down the street. When they were going down the hotel hallway, a man stopped them at gunpoint and forced them to open their hotel room door. He wasn't expecting to see all those people inside, but he didn't care. He proceeded to tell all of them, guys and girls, to strip down. Then he robbed them all and tried to kidnap a girl named Pam, but she started to scream. So he took poor Carol instead because she was calm and quiet. Then he forced the rest of them, the whole group, onto the balcony, where he locked the sliding glass door behind him. They were stuck out there screaming. No one was coming to help them. So one boy climbed onto a neighboring balcony and was able to knock on the door and get the people inside to call the cops. Unfortunately, it was too late. Carol's barely clothed body was later found on the side of the road, 100 miles away in Jacksonville. She too was shot in the head, like Chrissy. This case is still unsolved, despite the fact that a number of her friends had seen this man who took her and could give a clear description to the police. Both Chrissy and Carol had execution-style deaths. These are the type where there's no time to fight. You don't even realize you're going to be harmed, you're defenseless, and you're not expecting it to happen. It's quick, but it's no less horrifying. Now, there's one more similarity between these two cases. They were both cold. 4 months go by, and Chrissy's family is desperate for answers. They put out a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead them to her killer. No one comes forward. By September, Chrissy's brother Frank finally makes his first public statement. He was at his aunt's table, talking to reporters for the very first time. There were pictures of Chrissy all over the house, even one from the night she was killed, wearing that white baseball jersey. Frank said, "Why couldn't I protect her?" That's something that bothered him. She was all alone. His little sister didn't have a chance. The fact he couldn't be there to save her haunted him. He told reporters that the pair were always there for each other. It was as though they knew what the other was feeling, or when they were in trouble. Frank was 23 at the time and a student at the University of Rochester. The loss of his sister had torn him apart. He said it was the hardest thing he ever had to go through. She was a friend, not only a sister. He described it as crippling, like a part of him was gone. Frank wanted to make one thing clear: it wasn't Chrissy's fault that she was killed. Many people had questioned why she left without her friends at night and placed the blame on her. Frank said that tarnished his sister's memory and that she was portrayed poorly by the media as an underage partier, a boozer, and even a drug addict, which she wasn't. He said she was a typical 20-year-old doing what everyone else her age was doing. Victim blaming often occurs. She should have done this, she could have done that. Frank acknowledged that it's easy to judge, but insisted, "We don't know what position she was in. We don't know what we would have done in a similar situation." He emphasized that we can only learn from these situations, and that is one of his goals in telling these stories. It is not Chrissy's fault that she was murdered. The only person that's responsible for that is the evil person who chose to commit that crime. She wasn't a bad person. As a matter of fact, she was someone who was always there for others. She was the type to never say goodbye without saying she loved you. Frank recounted a time when he was really sick and Chrissy was by his side all night. She even fell asleep on the floor next to his bed, taking care of him. His message was, don't take things for granted. Don't take the people you love for granted. He said that the relationships he has now are treasures he values more than ever, because you don't know how long they will last. He also mentioned he was trying to heal and that he thinks Chrissy would have told him to go live his life with the energy and excitement that she did. He was trying, and he ended with, "Someday, I hope I can do that." It's bittersweet, and I think it's a great takeaway. We don't know how much time we have with anyone else, so cherish every moment. In this case, those moments turned into months and then years, and Chrissy's family and investigators held on to the hope that one day, with advanced technology or some other method, her murder would be solved. It wouldn't be until 2010 that someone who was keeping a secret about Chrissy's murder would finally be compelled to reveal the truth. 17 years after Chrissy was found dead, a call came into the Volusia County Sheriff's Office. It was April 20th, 2010. Warden Burl Kane from Louisiana State Penitentiary was on the other end. This penitentiary is better known as Angola. You might have heard that name before. It's the name of the slave plantation the prison is built on. It's a very famous prison, and the warden there at the time held the key to solving the case, a key to an inmate's cell. They were housing 38-year-old Romalis Gordon, who was serving 2 back-to-back life sentences for being caught on CCTV robbing Lucky's truck stop casino in Louisiana, and murdering 2 women, execution style. Assistant manager Schaefer Francis, a 29-year-old mother of 2, and a 64-year-old woman named Brenda Granny Robertson, who was an unarmed security guard. Romales was a regular there in 2006 when the crime occurred. Schaefer, the 29-year-old he gunned down, was a hard worker who never complained about her shifts at Lucky's. She was the first to volunteer her time to help others and always had a great attitude, according to her friends and family. She was willing to take on extra tasks, and everyone that knew her said she was also an amazing mother who was always by her daughter's side. Now she was gone. During her time as the assistant manager of this small casino, Schaefer monitored the flow of money from poker machines that were emptied by their employees and distributed that money to players as change. Math and numbers were her thing. This was her passion, and she enjoyed her work. In her free time, she spent time watching movies with her boyfriend. Romales Gordon's other victim, Brenda Robertson, the 64-year-old, weighed less than 100 pounds, but was the one who always helped Lucky stay trouble-free. There hadn't been any trouble until this double murder occurred. Schaefer and Brenda had a great working relationship and loved one another like family. No one at Lucky's casino had ever felt threatened or unsafe, so these murders were a shock to everyone. The prosecution in this case was initially planning to seek the death penalty against Romales. However, he pleaded guilty to Brenda and Schaefer's murders in exchange for 2 life sentences for first-degree murder in 2007. While he was serving that sentence, he heard a sermon from a visiting pastor named Jim Savala from the Brooklyn Tabernacle in New York City. He visited Angola once a year, and this sermon inspired Romales to write a letter to the warden. It was laced with biblical references like this one where he said, "How can I praise God on one hand, and in my heart and mind I know what pain I've caused someone for years and years. God sent me here for a reason, and until I confess what I have done, I cannot be freed from the belly of the whale." He said in his letter that the programs at the prison made him realize that you can't run from your past. He wrote, "All my family problems and sickness were because of my secret. I want to confess what I have done. I have all the details that only the murderer would have. I want to confess now. Now I'm going to hurt my own family by telling you the truth." But at the end he wrote, "Give the family closure. It's the right thing to do." That closure came in the form of confessing to the warden that he killed Christine Lazaro. Romales told details to the warden about the murder that had never been released to the public, like that the shots were fired at close range, one to her cheek and the other above her ear. The warden relayed all this information to the police department, and they ran his name. They discovered that Romales Gordon had been arrested on a trespassing charge just 40 miles from DeBerry, where Chrissy's body was dumped on the side of the road just 2 months after her murder. When they arrested him, they confiscated a .38 caliber weapon, which was the same caliber used on Chrissy. Naturally, they tried to find this gun. They wanted to see if it was still in evidence. However, it had been so long, and because they didn't know it was connected to any other crimes, especially a bigger crime, it had been destroyed. Detectives flew out to Louisiana to speak with Romales to make sure he was telling the truth. Right away, he became very emotional, and the detectives did not think he was putting on a show. By this time, the inmate worked as an orderly at the prison and was in charge of making sure that other inmates who had committed disciplinary offenses were on their best behavior. Romales had a really good conduct report and truly seemed to want to just get the secret off his chest. Once they believed they had their man, they had a lot of questions, the biggest one being, why? He explained that he was 21 years old at the time and had moved to Orlando about 4 months before the murder. He was on the run from police in Louisiana. One night, he was having fun hanging out in Daytona for spring break when he ran into Chrissy at Razzles. They started chatting and were hitting it off. He really liked her, and they were having a great time. To impress her, he lied about what he did for a living, claiming to be a rich record producer. They left and went to the 701 Club to grab some food, then headed to his motel room out in DeBerry. According to him, they had sex together, and he had also done a lot of cocaine and had been drinking all night long. Chrissy made a phone call while he went to the bathroom to do some more drugs. When he came out, he saw Chrissy going through some of his things, which included a couple of his fake IDs. He had warrants for his arrest and was using an alias at the time. When he saw her doing this, he became super paranoid, believing she was going to turn him in. Initially, he claimed he was just going to drop her back off in Daytona Beach, but instead, he freaked out According to him, on the way to drop her off, he told her to get out of the car, and that's when he ended up taking her life instead. It's a completely senseless motive. There was never any indication that Christine ever had intercourse with him or with anyone before her murder. So, I'm not really sure I believe that this is exactly how things went down. If I were to give my perspective, it would be mere speculation. We will never know the truth, but I find it hard to believe because it reminds me of the Samantha Josephson case, where there was a big struggle, unlike in this case. Randolph wrote a letter to Chrissy's dad asking for forgiveness, which was something that wasn't easy for Frank to read or come to terms with. How could he forgive the man who had callously taken his innocent daughter's life? But he's a Christian, and thought about it. He realized he wasn't the ultimate judge, so he was able to extend forgiveness to this man. However, Chrissy's friends did not feel the same way, and I tend to side more with her friends on this one. After hearing that someone had confessed to Chrissy's murder, it brought them back to that day in the hotel room when they first got the news. Rita said she hates Randolph. It doesn't matter if he's sorry, he doesn't bring Chrissy back, and he doesn't fix anything. Kelly expressed gratitude that he confessed, but believes he should pay for taking away their friend and for taking someone's life. And he will pay, he is paying. A year later, on May 25, 2011, Randolph Gordon pleaded guilty to Christine's murder. He was given yet another life sentence in Angola prison. This was a case that Detective Palermo, who was now retired by that time, had never forgotten. He was so happy that the family could get closure and to know that Chrissy's killer was behind bars forever. He doesn't think this case would have ever been solved. They put so much work into it, but without this confession, they probably would never have known who killed Chrissy.